He said it by accident. 3 words. She's my wife. The entire room went quiet. Crystal glasses stopped midair. Forks paused above expensive plates. And Victoria Ashbourne, the woman whose face appeared on the cover of Forbes, whose signature moved billions, stood completely still, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her chest. Ethan Calloway waited for her to correct it. He wanted her to correct it. She didn't. Instead, she leaned close enough that he could smell the faint jasmine in her hair, and whispered 4 words that would dismantle every wall he'd spent 7 years building. Don't take it back. If you're watching from your city right now, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the very end, because this one will stay with you. 32 wasn't supposed to look like this. Ethan Calloway stood in the narrow bathroom of his 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, staring at a reflection that had accumulated its share of damage. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there at 25. Not the romantic kind. Not the brooding kind that looked good in photographs. The real kind. The kind you get from waking up at 2 a.m. because a 7-year-old has a nightmare about her mother not coming back, and you have to sit on the edge of a small bed shaped like a race car and explain, again, gently, carefully, without breaking your own face, that some people just leave, but you are not one of those people. He splashed cold water on his face, checked his watch. 6:47 a.m. Dad? The voice came from the hallway just outside the bathroom door. Small. Specific. The kind of voice that could cut through concrete. Dad, I can't find my left shoe. But which left shoe? The left one. Ethan dried his hands. Lily, you have 4 pairs of shoes. I need that one. He opened the bathroom door. Lily Calloway stood in the hallway wearing her school uniform, navy skirt, white button-down shirt, 1 white sneaker on her right foot, and a pink sock on her bare left foot. Her hair was half braided. She was holding a juice box with one hand and pointing accusatorially at the floor with the other. She was, objectively, the most demanding person in Ethan's life. She was also the only reason he hadn't completely hollowed out. Check under your bed, he said. I checked. Check again. Dad? Lily. She turned and stomped back down the hall, grumbling. Ethan followed, found the shoe in 11 seconds. It was between her bed and the wall where it always was, and handed it to her without comment. She put it on without thanking him, which was fine. She was 7. Gratitude was a work in progress. By 7:20, they were in the car. Lily had her backpack, her lunch, and her favorite book, a battered copy of Charlotte's Web that she'd read 4 times and still cried at the end of, every single time. Dad, she said from the back seat, is Miss Victoria coming to my recital? Ethan kept his eyes on the road. I don't know, Bug. She's busy. You always say she's busy, because she usually is. Lily considered this, but she came to my birthday. She did. And she remembered I don't like strawberry frosting. She did. And she brought me the book about the girl who builds rockets. Lily, I'm just saying. A pause. She remembers things about me. Ethan said nothing to that, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't unravel something he'd kept carefully folded for a very long time. Victoria Ashbourne remembered things about Lily. She also remembered that Ethan took his coffee with exactly 1.5 sugars, not 2. That he couldn't watch medical dramas without getting anxious because of what happened with his mother. That he always held elevator doors open even when he was running late. That he laughed differently, actually differently, from somewhere deeper, when something genuinely caught him off guard. She remembered all of it, and Ethan had spent 7 years pretending that the fact that she remembered didn't mean anything at all. He dropped Lily at school. She kissed his cheek, quickly because they were in front of other kids, and ran toward the entrance without looking back. He watched until she disappeared through the double doors. Then he sat in the school parking lot for 2 minutes longer than he needed to, doing nothing. It was a habit, not a bad one. Just a small, private moment that belonged to nobody but him, where he could sit with the weight of everything. The work shifts, the grocery lists, the parent-teacher emails, the dental appointments, the question of whether he was doing any of this right, and let it settle before he carried it forward again. His phone buzzed. Victoria. Are you free tonight? I need a favor. Kind of a big one. He stared at the message. Victoria Ashbourne's kind of a big one had, over the years, ranged from help me rehearse a board presentation at midnight to I accidentally booked 2 hotels in the same city, which one should I stay at? To once, memorably, I think I accidentally started a bidding war with a foreign investor. Is this a problem? He typed back. Depends on the favor. Victoria. I need you to come to my family's gathering this weekend in Napa. Ethan. When this weekend? Victoria. Friday night through Sunday. Ethan. Victoria. Victoria. I know. Ethan. I have Lily. Victoria. Bring her. My mother loves kids, or at least she pretends to convincingly. He exhaled slowly. Ethan. Why do you need me specifically? A long pause. Long enough that he started the car, pulled out of the lot, and had driven 3 blocks before her response came through. Victoria. Because they're going to spend the whole weekend asking why I'm still unmarried and whether I'm happy in the specific way that means they don't think I am. And I'd rather have someone there who actually knows me than stand there alone and smile and pretend I'm not exhausted by all of it. He pulled over to the side of the road. Read it again. There it was. The thing Victoria almost never admitted. The exhaustion. The weight of being Victoria Ashbourne in rooms full of people who had opinions about what Victoria Ashbourne should be doing with her life. Ethan. I'll be there. People who read about Victoria Ashbourne in business publications got a specific version of her, sharp, decisive, unsentimental. The kind of woman who had built a technology and real estate empire before 30 by seeing angles that other people didn't see, by moving faster and thinking harder and sleeping less, by turning every setback into a restructured strategy. That version wasn't wrong exactly. It was just incomplete. The version Ethan knew was more complicated and, in his opinion, more interesting. Victoria Ashbourne, up close, was a woman who alphabetized her bookshelves but stacked her magazines in no discernible order. Who could negotiate a multi-million-dollar acquisition without blinking but spent 20 minutes in the cereal aisle comparing sugar content because she genuinely couldn't decide? Who was startlingly funny when she was relaxed. Not polished funny, not the kind of wit that worked in speeches, but genuinely funny, the kind of humor that surprised even herself, that came out sideways when she wasn't performing. She was also, though she would have disputed this characterization strongly, lonely. Not in a dramatic way, not visibly. Victoria's loneliness was architectural, built into the structure of her life rather than sitting on the surface of it. There were the 90-hour weeks, the way her relationships with men had consistently fractured against the thing she was, against the scale of her, against the weight of what being with someone like her actually required. The way her family loved her but had spent years loving a projection of her, a version they'd constructed from headlines and accomplishments rather than the actual person who sometimes sat in her enormous kitchen at midnight eating cereal from the box because she hadn't had time for dinner and didn't want to call anyone. She and Ethan had met 7 years ago through a mutual friend at a birthday party in someone's backyard in southeast Portland. She'd been 23, still building, still early enough in her ascent that she wasn't yet fully encased in the armor of it. He'd been 25, recently separated from Lily's mother, who had been gone 4 months by then, and holding a sleeping Lily against his shoulder with the careful precision of a man who had taught himself, fast and imperfectly, to be everything a small person needed. They talked for 3 hours in lawn chairs while everyone else moved around them. She'd asked him what it was like doing it alone. He'd answered honestly, which surprised him. He usually kept those answers vague. Something about the way she asked made deflection feel impolite. She'd said, at some point, I think you're the most genuinely present person I've met in years. He'd said, that might just be exhaustion. She'd laughed, genuinely, the sideways kind. And the friendship had started there, with that laugh, in that backyard, with Lily asleep against his shoulder. 7 years later, he was still trying very hard not to be in love with her. It wasn't working particularly well. Victoria called him Thursday evening, the night before they were supposed to drive down to Napa. Tell me honestly, she said, without preamble. How bad is this going to be? He was making dinner, pasta, simple, with the sauce Lily preferred. He wedged the phone between his ear and shoulder. Define bad. My mother's going to introduce me to at least 2 eligible men she's vetted. My cousin Marcus is going to say something condescending about my business that's framed as a compliment. And my Aunt Diane will ask me, I guarantee you within the first hour, whether I've considered freezing. Freezing what? Ethan. Right, sorry, okay. He stirred the sauce. How many people total? 20-something. It's the annual thing. My parents rent the Beaumont estate. It's this vineyard property in Napa. It's a lot. He knew. He'd seen photos once, stone buildings, manicured grounds, a terrace that overlooked rows of vines that stretched to the hills, the kind of place that communicated wealth so comfortably it didn't need to try. You've done this before without backup, he said. I've survived it before without backup, she corrected. There's a difference. He didn't push that. Lily's excited, he offered. She asked if there would be horses. Victoria made a sound that was almost a laugh. There might actually be horses. Don't tell her that until we're already there, or she'll talk about nothing else the entire drive down. 4 hours of horse conversation. At minimum. This time she did laugh, properly. And then it went quiet, and in that quiet he heard something he'd learned to recognize over the years. The particular silence that meant Victoria was about to say something real. I'm glad you're coming, she said. It was simple, direct, not dressed up. It genuinely helps having you there. I know that's probably Victoria. What? Just say you're glad. You don't have to qualify it. A beat. I'm glad, she said. Good, he said. I'm glad too. He went back to stirring the sauce and tried not to think about the particular frequency of her voice when she was being unguarded. He'd gotten very skilled, over 7 years, at not thinking about it. They arrived Friday evening, just as the light was turning gold over the vineyard hills. Lily had, in fact, talked about horses for approximately 2.5 of the 4 hours. She had also eaten 2 granola bars, fallen asleep briefly, woken up and asked if they were there yet exactly 14 times by Ethan's count, and then fallen asleep again in the last 40 minutes, and had to be gently extracted from her booster seat in a state of confused semi-consciousness. Victoria had driven. Her car was substantially nicer than Ethan's, a dark blue Range Rover, clean and quiet. And she drove it the way she did most things, with full attention and without unnecessary commentary. Ethan had sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape change as Portland fell behind them and California began, and he'd thought about nothing in particular, which was one of the things he could only do around Victoria. She was one of the few people in his life with whom silence was never uncomfortable. The estate was exactly as the photograph suggested, and somehow also more. Long gravel driveway flanked by old oak trees. The main house was built of pale stone, 3 stories, with wide terraces on each level. Flower beds and structured garden paths cut through the grounds, and in the distance, past the manicured lawn, the vineyard rows began in precise green lines. It's big, Lily said from Ethan's arms, still half asleep, her head on his shoulder. It is, he agreed. Are we staying here? For 2 nights, yeah. She thought about this. Is Miss Victoria's family nice? Victoria, who was pulling bags from the back of the Range Rover, paused imperceptibly, just for a second. Their family, Ethan said, which was a true statement and not quite an answer, and Lily, still not fully awake, accepted it as such. The first person they encountered inside was Victoria's mother. Eleanor Ashbourne was 61 years old and looked like what would happen if a person decided that graceful aging was less a natural process and more a personal project to be optimized. She was elegant in the specific way that required effort and resources, and a complete refusal to acknowledge either. She wore cream linen. Her hair was silver-streaked blonde, pinned back. Her smile, when it appeared, was warm and calibrated in equal measure. She was also, Ethan would learn over the next 48 hours, sharper than she presented. Victoria, she embraced her daughter with the efficiency of someone who had a great deal of greeting to accomplish that evening. You look tired. Hello, Mom. I'm not. You work too hard. I hear that. Eleanor's eyes moved to Ethan, taking him in with the specific attention of a person accustomed to assessing situations quickly. Then they moved to Lily, still draped over Ethan's shoulder, and something in her expression shifted. Not softer exactly, but more interested. "And who's this?" "I'm Lily." From Ethan's shoulder, still not at full capacity. "I'm 7. Are there horses?" Eleanor blinked. "There are, actually, 2 of them. Thomas and Margot." Lily lifted her head fully for the first time. "Which one's bigger?" "Thomas. By quite a bit." "Can I see them?" "Tomorrow, when it's light." Lily settled back against Ethan's shoulder, apparently satisfied with this negotiation. Eleanor looked at Ethan. "You must be the friend Victoria mentioned," she said. "Ethan Calloway." He offered his hand. "Thank you for having us." "Of course." She shook it. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were still reading him. "Victoria didn't mention you'd be bringing your daughter." "I hope that's—" No, it's fine. It's lovely." But she was looking at Victoria now, and Ethan caught the edge of a question in it. Not rude, but present. Why is he here? What does this mean? Victoria met her mother's gaze steadily. "I'm going to show Ethan and Lily their room," she said. "We'll be down for dinner." But their room, a guest suite on the second floor, had high ceilings and long windows overlooking the garden. There was a queen bed, and in the adjoining sitting area, a fold-out couch that Lily claimed immediately upon seeing it, despite the fact that she'd been half asleep 30 seconds earlier. "I call this one," she announced. "It's a pull-out couch," Ethan said. "It folds. That's interesting." He couldn't argue with that logic. He set her bag down, looked around the room, stone fireplace, heavy linen curtains, an oil painting of the vineyard from a distance, and felt briefly and specifically the sensation of being in a world that wasn't his. Not in a bad way, just the honest awareness that this was Victoria's world, or her family's version of it. And his presence here was, for the weekend, operating under terms he hadn't fully anticipated. Victoria appeared in the doorway. She'd changed already. She was faster at everything than most people, into a simple dark dress. She looked at Lily, who was now systematically unfolding and refolding the pull-out couch mechanism. "She's going to do that for 20 minutes, Ethan said. "I know." Victoria smiled, the real kind. "Dinner's in 45. It's formal-ish, but not black tie." "Define formal-ish." "Jacket. You'll be fine. I saw your bag." "You saw my bag." "I packed for you once, for that conference in Seattle. I know what you own." He remembered that. She'd also alphabetized his conference schedule by session name, unprompted, because she'd noticed him losing track of time between panels. He hadn't asked her to. She'd just done it because it was useful. "Victoria," he said. She was already turning to leave. "Yeah. Thank you for the invite, seriously." She turned back, looked at him for a second with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "You drove 4 hours with a horse enthusiast," she said. "Thank you." Then she was gone. Lily, from the pull-out couch. "Dad, I figured out the lever." "Good job, Bug." The dining room held 23 people, and within 11 minutes of Ethan sitting down, he had received from various Ashbourne relatives the following assessments disguised as questions. "What is it you do exactly?" "Construction project management." A pause. "Oh, and your daughter's mother. Is she in the picture?" "No." Another pause, this one longer. "Where in Portland did you say you lived?" "Northeast." A nod that communicated something unflattering. "How did you and Victoria meet?" "A friend's birthday." A frown that suggested this was insufficient. The person asking most of these questions was Marcus Ashbourne, Victoria's cousin, 35, the kind of handsome that had never required effort and had therefore never built character. He ran a hedge fund of some variety. He wore his watch on the outside of his shirt cuff, which was a thing Ethan had not previously known people did. Marcus had the particular quality of a person who delivered condescension so smoothly that it arrived before the recipient had identified it as such. He smiled constantly. It was never warm. "Victoria's always had eclectic taste in friends," he he said at one point, leaning back in his chair with the ease of someone who owned rooms like this one in spirit, even when they didn't on paper. I think it's one of her more interesting qualities. Eclectic, Ethan repeated, diverse, varied. Marcus gestured vaguely. She doesn't limit herself to, type. Ethan looked at him for a moment without expression. I wasn't aware friendship required a type. Marcus smiled. Of course not. It's a compliment. Across the table, Victoria was deep in conversation with her aunt about something. Ethan couldn't hear it, but he saw her glance over, catch the exchange, read it in approximately 1 second, and fractionally tighten her jaw. Lily, seated beside Ethan with a special plate that Eleanor's kitchen staff had assembled from regular dinner components, the child had diplomatically rejected the tartine but enthusiastically accepted the roasted potatoes and the plain chicken, was untroubled by any of this. She was explaining Charlotte's Web to Victoria's elderly Uncle Gerald, who appeared both confused and genuinely engaged. The spider dies, Lily was saying matter-of-factly, but it's okay because her children stay. There's a lot of them. They're small. Gerald adjusted his hearing aid. That's quite a story. It's my favorite. You've read it before? 4 times. I cry at the end every time. Gerald looked at this child for a moment. Me too, he said finally, though he almost certainly hadn't read it. But it was the right thing to say, and something in his expression suggested he understood instinctively that this was a child who deserved to be met where she was. Ethan watched this exchange and felt something unclench in his chest. Mad. After dinner, the family migrated to the terrace. The evening was warm, lit with string lights and the soft glow from inside. People drank wine and settled into conversations in clusters, and Ethan found himself standing at the terrace railing, looking out at the darkened vineyard, drink in hand, present but peripheral. He heard heels on stone, and then Victoria was beside him. "How are you doing?" she said. It wasn't entirely a question. "Fine," he paused. "Marcus is a treat." "Yes." She exhaled slowly. "He's been doing that since we were children. He does it to everyone. It's just that usually the people I bring here can—" She stopped. "Can what? Push back more effectively?" She turned to look at him. I wasn't going to say that, but it was somewhere in the sentence. A beat. "I meant to say that usually the people I bring are less—" She seemed to be selecting carefully. "Less genuine than you. So his thing bounces off them more easily because they're performing too, and it becomes this whole," she gestured, "status theater. You just looked at him like he was being mildly irritating, which he was, and that's probably going to bother him more than anything else you could have done." Ethan considered this. That wasn't strategic. He was just being irritating. "I know." She was smiling faintly. "That's what I mean." They were quiet for a moment. The vineyard below was very still. "They're going to keep wondering why you're here," Victoria said. "My mother especially. She won't ask directly, but she's going to wonder." "Let her. I just don't want you to feel—" "Victoria." He turned to look at her. "I've been a single dad at school pickup, at the pediatrician, at parent-teacher nights, for 7 years. I've stood in rooms where I was the only one doing what I was doing. I'm fine standing in rooms where people have questions." She looked at him for a moment. "I forget sometimes," she said, "that you're—" She searched for the word. "Sturdy. Is that a compliment?" "It's the truest thing I could say." He didn't know what to do with that. He looked back out at the vineyard. "Lily asked me if you'd remember that she hates strawberry frosting," he said, "when it's not your birthday that's happening." Victoria blinked. "What?" "She said you remembered it at her birthday. She was, I don't know, noting it." A long silence. "She's a very perceptive kid," Victoria said. "She really is," he agreed. The incident happened the following morning at breakfast. The estate's dining room had been reset for a more casual arrangement. A long buffet along one wall, smaller tables scattered rather than the formal single table of the night before. People came and went in waves, some still in robes, some fully dressed. The Saturday morning loose and unhurried in the way that weekends at estates with no obligation to be anywhere could be. Ethan had gotten up at 6:30. Old habit, Lily's internal clock was still active even on weekends, and they'd spent an hour in the garden before anyone else appeared. Lily had found a stone path that wound around the back of the house toward the stables, and they'd followed it in the early cool air, Lily talking about something at school, Ethan listening with the automatic attentiveness of someone who'd learned to track two conversations simultaneously, the one happening and the one underneath it. The horses were indeed there. Thomas was enormous, a dark bay, and Lily stood at the fence and stared at him with the particular reverence she reserved for things she'd been wanting to see for a long time. "He's huge," she breathed. "He is. Is he scary?" "I don't know. I'm not a horse." She looked at Ethan sideways, unamused. "Dad? What? I genuinely don't know how horses feel about things." The stable hand, a young woman named Rosa, appeared and offered to let Lily pet Thomas from outside the fence, and the next 25 minutes were among the most focused Lily had been in recent memory. By the time they made it to the breakfast buffet, most of the family was assembled. Victoria was there, at a small table near the window with her mother, and she looked up when they entered and smiled. The real one, the sideways one. And Lily went directly to her with the zero hesitation trajectory of a child who has never been made to feel unwelcome. "Miss Victoria, Thomas let me touch his nose." "Did he?" "It's very soft and warm and big." She spread her hands to approximate the size of a horse's nose, which was necessarily approximate. "Like this." "That sounds exactly right." Ethan went to the buffet, filled plates for himself and Lily, and joined them at the table. Eleanor watched this quiet domestic sequence. Plates filled, juice poured, Lily's chair pulled out, with an expression that was either calculating or simply curious. Ethan couldn't tell. He was beginning to think the two weren't mutually exclusive in Eleanor Ashbourne. A waitress came to take additional drink orders, young and efficient, working her way around the various tables. She reached theirs and looked at Victoria, then at Ethan, then at Lily, and her expression settled into a particular warmth. "What a lovely family," she said. She turned to Victoria. "Would your husband like coffee or tea?" The sentence landed in the air between the four of them. Victoria's eyes moved to Ethan. Ethan's mouth opened, and something came out before the considered version of himself could intervene. "She's my wife." It was quiet, specific, completely calm, as if he'd said it 1,000 times. The waitress smiled. "Coffee, then?" "Please," Ethan said, because apparently he was going to continue talking. The waitress moved on. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Ethan. From across the dining room, Eleanor was watching. Lily was eating toast with the focused serenity of someone with no investment in adult confusion. Ethan exhaled. "Sorry," he started, low enough that only Victoria could hear it. "I don't know why I—" Victoria leaned forward slightly. Her voice was barely a sound. Was private, just for him, and completely unhurried. "Don't take it back." He stopped. She held his gaze for exactly 1 moment more, and then she reached for her orange juice and looked down at her plate, as if she'd said nothing of consequence. As if those 4 words hadn't just rerouted everything. He didn't take it back. He wasn't sure he knew how, given that Eleanor Ashbourne had clearly observed the exchange from 30 feet away, and the particular way she was now watching her daughter suggested that some internal narrative in her mind had just updated in ways Ethan couldn't track. The breakfast continued. People finished eating. Victoria navigated a conversation with her uncle Gerald about the vineyard's recent expansion, and Ethan helped Lily find more of the roasted potatoes that had reappeared on the buffet, and on the surface everything was exactly as it had been 45 minutes ago. Except it wasn't. He was aware of Victoria in a different frequency now. The way she said his name across the table to include him in a conversation. The way, when Marcus appeared, fresh blazer, fresh condescension, and made a comment about the peculiarity of Ethan's presence, Victoria said, calmly, and without looking at Marcus at all, "He's my husband. He doesn't need a reason to be here beyond that." And then she went back to her conversation. Marcus's expression went through 3 distinct phases in about 2 seconds. Lily, for her part, looked up from her potatoes when Victoria said husband, looked at Ethan, and then went back to her potatoes with absolutely no discernible reaction, which was either because she hadn't processed it or because at 7 years old she had already developed a very Lily way of filing certain information for later. Ethan didn't know which. After breakfast, he found a quiet moment when Lily had gone back outside with Rosa to see Thomas again, and he caught Victoria alone in the hallway near the library. "We need to talk," he said. "Yes." She said it like she'd been waiting for him to say it. They went into the library. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling shelves, a window seat looking out over the garden. Victoria sat on the edge of the window seat. Ethan stood. He wasn't sure he could sit down for this conversation. "I shouldn't have said it," he started, "but you did." "Victoria. And I told you not to take it back." She was looking at him directly. Not performed calm, actual calm, which in his experience with her meant she had already thought about this, probably for longer than he realized. "So I need you to understand I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to hear me out." He waited. "They're going to spend this whole weekend trying to find a reason why I'm not enough," she said. Not bitterly, just factually. "Not my family, exactly. Some of them. Marcus, a few others. And I am so tired of performing that I'm fine with it, that it doesn't touch me." A pause. "It touches me. I know. You've always known that." She looked out the window at the garden briefly, then back at him. If we just let it be for the weekend, let them believe it's true. I know it's a lie, and I know that's not nothing, and if you're not okay with it, I understand completely, but I think—" She stopped. "I think I can get through this weekend without drowning if you're beside me as—" "I'll do it," he said. She blinked. "Just like that." "You can get through this weekend without drowning regardless," he said. "You're not as fragile as they want you to be, but yeah, if it helps, I'll do it." Something moved through her expression that he didn't know how to name. Not relief exactly, something more complicated and more careful than relief. "There are rules," she said, recovering. "We have to be consistent, know things a couple would know about each other. We've known each other 7 years. Right." A pause. "And Lily, I'll talk to Lily. She's 7. She's adaptable." He thought about it. "I'll tell her we're playing pretend for the weekend. She'll think it's a game. She's good at games." Victoria looked at him. "You're very calm about this." "One of us has to be." A beat. Something shifted. And then, because this was what they did, what they'd always done, because underneath all of it, they were just two people who had figured out how to make each other laugh, Victoria said very seriously. "We should probably know each other's coffee orders." "I already know yours." "I know yours too, but for the performance." "Black, 1 sugar, 1.5. "I know," he said. "I said 1 for the dramatic effect." She laughed, the sideways kind. And something settled briefly between them, in the warm library of a house that wasn't either of theirs, where they just agreed to something that was either the most honest lie or the most dishonest truth either of them had ever told. Outside the window, in the garden, Lily was running back toward the house, her arms spread wide, the morning light catching in her hair, shouting something about Thomas that neither of them could hear through the glass. Ethan watched her and felt, deeply and specifically, the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something he couldn't entirely see the shape of yet. He didn't step back. By Saturday afternoon, the word had spread through the family gathering in the way information always travels through gatherings like this one. Fast, not entirely accurately, and with embellishments applied at each handoff. Eleanor had mentioned it to her sister Patricia. Patricia had mentioned it to her daughter, who told Marcus, who told 2 other cousins, and by the time the afternoon wine tasting convened on the terrace, it was established knowledge that Victoria Ashbourne was married to the quiet man with the little girl, and nobody had known, and wasn't that interesting, and why hadn't she said anything, and Victoria handled the questions with a composure that Ethan found, privately, extraordinary to watch. Not because she was lying, but he'd known her to be entirely comfortable with strategic omission when necessary, but because the answers she gave weren't entirely lies. They were true things deployed carefully. How long? Long enough that it stopped feeling new. Why didn't you say anything? We're private people. A wedding? Small, just what mattered. And when her Aunt Diane asked, inevitably, about children, looking at Lily, who was across the terrace teaching Uncle Gerald a card game she had invented on the spot, Victoria looked at Lily for a moment and said quietly, "She's exactly what she is," which wasn't an answer, but it was something true. Ethan, standing close enough to Victoria that it read as the comfortable proximity of people who'd shared space for a long time. Because it was, because they had, just not in the way anyone here understood, caught that sentence and turned it over in his head for a moment. She's exactly what she is. Later, after the wine tasting had dissolved into evening conversations and pre-dinner movement, Marcus found Ethan alone near the terrace railing. "I'll be direct," Marcus said. He always prefaced direct statements this way, which in Ethan's experience meant he was about to be anything but. "This is unusual. Victoria and I have been close for a long time, and she's never once mentioned, 'That's between Victoria and me,'" Ethan said. "Of course." That smile. "I'm just wondering about the timing. She brings this to a family gathering, announces it in passing, almost accidentally. It reads like—" He paused. "It reads like a performance." Ethan looked at him, took a breath, and then said simply, "Marcus, I don't particularly care what it reads like to you." Marcus's smile went slightly rigid. "I came here because Victoria asked me to," Ethan continued, "and because she's someone who matters to me, and she needed someone in her corner. If that doesn't fit whatever narrative you've already built about her, that's—" He gestured in a way that suggested Marcus's narrative was Marcus's problem. "That's yours to deal with." He turned and walked back toward where Victoria was standing with her mother, and he didn't look to see Marcus's expression because it didn't matter. He could feel, as he walked toward her, that Victoria had seen the exchange. When he reached her side, she didn't say anything. She just angled slightly toward him, barely perceptible, in the way that people do when they feel something tether. Eleanor beside her watched this small movement with an expression Ethan couldn't read. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't know until much later, was that Eleanor Ashbourne, who was a great many things but was not stupid, had already formed a question about the truth of what she was observing. She was simply waiting for the right moment to ask it. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep on the pull-out couch, with the certainty of a child who had used every available unit of energy on horses and invented card games, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of the guest suite and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the waitress, the sentence she'd said, the ease with which she'd assumed it. He thought about the way he'd answered, the reflex of it, the fact that it hadn't felt like a lie when it came out. He thought about, "Don't take it back," and the specific way Victoria had said it, not panicked, not calculated, but like someone naming a thing they'd decided. He thought about 7 years. The birthday parties, the late-night calls, the time she'd driven 3 hours to Portland when Lily had been in the hospital with a fever that spiked to 104, and she'd sat in the waiting room for 4 hours reading a magazine she hadn't looked at, just to be there when he came out. The time she'd fallen asleep on his couch watching a bad movie, and he'd covered her with a blanket and spent 20 minutes too long deciding whether to go sit back down. He thought about all the ways he'd talked himself out of it, all the reasonable, sensible architecture he'd built to keep that particular feeling behind glass. You can see it from here, just don't touch it. Just leave it alone. You have Lily to consider, and she has her world, and you have yours, and the friendship is worth more. The friendship is worth more. The friendship is worth... From the pull-out couch, Lily made a small sound in her sleep. He looked over at her, the small shape of her, the slow breathing. She touched a horse's nose this morning and spread her hands wide to show Victoria how large it was. And Victoria had said that sounds exactly right, like it was the most important information she'd received that day. He lay back on the bed, looked at the ceiling, and thought about the word wife, and the way it had come out of him with exactly no hesitation. She's my wife. As if somewhere inside him it had always been true, and his mouth had simply, finally, caught up. He didn't sleep for a long time. Outside, the vineyard was still. The string lights on the terrace had been turned off. Somewhere in the old stone house, 23 people were sleeping, or not sleeping, or dreaming about things they wanted and had or wanted and didn't have or wanted and didn't know how to name. Ethan lay in the dark of a room that wasn't his, in a house that wasn't his, playing a role that was also somehow the most honest thing he'd done in years. And he thought, this is the problem, isn't it? Not the lie. The part that wasn't a lie at all. Sunday morning arrived the way mornings do when you haven't fully slept. Not sudden, but gradual and unkind, the light through the curtains arriving before Ethan was ready for it. He'd been awake since 5. He'd lain there for an hour listening to Lily's breathing from the pull-out couch. Steady, completely uncomplicated, the breathing of someone who had no unresolved architecture in her chest. And then he'd gotten up quietly, dressed, and gone downstairs before anyone else appeared. The estate kitchen in the early morning was a different place than the estate kitchen at any other hour. Emptied of staff, emptied of family, it was just a large room with good light and the smell of old stone and whatever had been baked the night before. Ethan found the coffee, found the filters, found the machine that was far more complicated than it needed to be, and spent 4 minutes figuring it out through the specific problem-solving methodology of a person who was too tired to be defeated by an appliance. He was on his second cup when Victoria appeared. She was in a gray sweater and loose trousers, her hair down, not yet fully into whatever the day required of her. She looked at him, looked at the coffee machine, and said nothing, which was the correct response to someone who was already making coffee at 6 in the morning in someone else's kitchen. She sat down across from him at the kitchen island. He pushed the second cup toward her. He'd made 2, knowing, without deciding to know, that she would appear at some point. She wrapped both hands around it. You didn't sleep. I slept. You have the face of someone who had a conversation with the ceiling for 4 hours. He looked at her. Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to drink your coffee first? Coffee, she said immediately. They sat in the quiet of the empty kitchen for a while. Outside, the vineyard was pale in the early light, the rows of vines still and symmetrical against the hill. A bird moved across the window frame. The refrigerator hummed. It was the most normal 4 minutes of the past 24 hours. My mother knows something is off, Victoria said, when she'd gotten through enough of the coffee to be ready for the sentence. She hasn't said it directly, but she has a look. She was giving it to me at dinner last night. What kind of look? The kind that means she's filing information for later use. She's patient. She'll wait until she has enough. Victoria turned the cup slowly in her hands. She's going to ask one of us something direct at some point today, and it'll be framed as casual, and if we're not ready for it, we'll trip. Ethan thought about this. What would she ask? She'd ask when or where, somewhere specific that we'd have to have an actual answer for. Victoria paused. She got married at St. Anselm's in Boston, and she asked everyone at her wedding where they planned to get married, so she'll probably start there. So we need a where. We need a where. He thought about it for a moment. Backyard wedding, he said. Someone's backyard in Southeast Portland, friend's place, small. Victoria looked at him. It fits, he said. It's true to both of us. Neither of us would do something large. You've thought about this. I've had 4 hours. She was quiet for a moment. Then, with something that was almost a smile. What friend's backyard? Danny Kowalski. He's real. Your mother won't be able to verify him, and if she tries, she'll find he exists. Danny Kowalski was a guy Ethan had known since college who had, in fact, had people over for a party in his substantial Southeast Portland backyard. He was a landscaper. His backyard was nice. Danny Kowalski, Victoria repeated. Good man. Big yard. We don't have to tell him. This time she did smile, and it was the sideways kind. The one that meant she was genuinely caught off guard by something. You're better at this than I expected. I manage construction projects. The job is basically finding solutions before problems become crises. Is that what this is? I haven't decided yet. She looked at him across the kitchen island, and for a moment the performance of it fell away entirely. The story they were telling, the arrangement they'd agreed to. And it was just the two of them in an early morning kitchen, holding coffee cups, being honest in the way they'd always been honest, which was imperfectly and carefully and without very much of the protective distance that most people maintained. Are you okay? She asked. Not the social version. the real one. Yeah, he meant it, mostly. You? I don't know. She looked at the window. I keep thinking about what I told you last night, that I needed you in my corner, and I keep wondering if that was fair to ask. I said yes. You say yes to a lot of things. Not really. He let that sit. I say yes when I mean it. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was easy. Then she looked back at the coffee cup. Thank you, she said. Simple, not dressed up. For last night. For not making it weird. He didn't say anything to that because the honest answer, it was already weird, it's been weird for a while, I'm just better at carrying it than you think, was a sentence he wasn't going to say in the kitchen of her mother's rented estate on a Sunday morning. We should probably figure out how long we've been married, he said. 2 years, she said immediately. Long enough to be settled, short enough that people can believe we kept it quiet. Okay. And you proposed? At the diner on Morrison, the one with the green booths. He watched her reaction. You always get the same thing there. You know the order without looking at the menu. She went very still for a second. You remember that? I remember most things, he said, which was true, and which he delivered in a tone that made it sound like a simple fact rather than what it actually was, which was 7 years of paying close attention to a person he loved without adequate permission to do so. She opened her mouth, and then they heard footsteps from the hallway, and the moment sealed itself and was filed somewhere neither of them would access directly. Not today, and maybe not for a long time. It was Lily. She was dressed, remarkably, in her full school uniform, which she had packed for reasons that remained unclear since there was no school this weekend, and she was carrying Charlotte's Web under one arm and wearing both shoes. I want to see Thomas again, she announced, before breakfast. Ethan checked the clock. 6:52 a.m. Rosa probably isn't there yet. Thomas is there. Thomas is there, he agreed, because he couldn't argue with that either. Give it 20 minutes. Lily looked at Victoria. Miss Victoria, do you like horses? I think so, Victoria said. I haven't spent much time with them. Lily considered this seriously. You should come see Thomas. He's calming. Where did you learn the word calming? Miss Henderson uses it, about deep breathing. Lily opened her book to the page she'd bookmarked and settled onto the stool beside Victoria, as if she'd done this 1,000 times, as if this kitchen in this house where she'd never been before was somewhere she'd decided to belong. I'll read until it's time. Victoria looked at Ethan. He looked back at her with an expression that said, This is Lily. This is what she does. I don't know how to explain it either. And then, because she was Victoria, she turned to Lily and said, What page are you on? The part where Wilbur figures out what's happening. Lily's voice went slightly smaller. It's sad, but it's important. Can I read it with you? Lily held the book so they could both see it. And Ethan stood on the other side of the kitchen island with his coffee cup and watched the two most important people in his life read a book together at 6:50 in the morning in someone else's kitchen, and he thought, this is the thing I'm most afraid to want, and I want it anyway. The ceiling was right. He hadn't slept at all. Eleanor Ashbourne came downstairs at 7:15 and found them exactly like that. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before anyone noticed her, and in that moment she looked at the three of them. The man with his coffee, the woman with her shoulder angled toward the child pointing at a sentence on the page. And her expression did something quiet and complex that none of them saw. When she cleared her throat and said good morning, her voice was a fraction warmer than it had been the night before. Ethan noticed. He filed it and said nothing. The morning moved forward the way the rest of the weekend would, in the complex choreography of a lie that kept turning up truths neither of them had intended to speak aloud. Marcus appeared at breakfast with the specific energy of someone who had spent part of the night reconsidering a position. He was more measured, less overtly pointed. He watched Ethan and Victoria in the way that someone watches a situation they've reclassified from understood to unclear, which was a form of respect, of a kind, and Ethan neither sought it nor required it, but he noticed it was there. Victoria's Aunt Diane, who had indeed asked about freezing within the first hour of Friday evening, Victoria had simply said, I'm keeping my options open, in a tone that closed the topic with surgical precision, softened considerably when Lily explained, in elaborate detail, the difference between Thomas and Margot's personalities based on her interactions with them over approximately 90 minutes of total acquaintance. Thomas is serious, Lily said. He doesn't show you everything at once. Margot is friendly, but you can tell she knows you're watching. Gerald, who had eaten breakfast at the same table as Lily both mornings now, said, "That sounds like people." Lily looked at him. "Yeah," she said, as if this were obvious. "That's why I'm telling you." Gerald smiled in a way that reached something real, and Ethan thought that whatever else this weekend was doing, it had given his daughter an 80-year-old friend who understood the value of paying attention to living things, and that wasn't nothing. The thing that cracked it open, not broke it, cracked it, the way a fault line shifts without yet becoming a collapse, happened Sunday afternoon, 2 hours before they were supposed to drive back to Portland. They were on the terrace. The family had gathered in that loose, unhurried way that happens at the end of gatherings, when people have run out of formal occasion and are just existing near each other in the afternoon light. Wine again, though not as much. Conversations in smaller clusters. Victoria was talking to her mother and 2 cousins near the terrace table. Ethan was a few feet away with Lily, who had given up on company and was lying on a terrace lounger reading, her shoes off, her feet in white socks crossed at the ankle, completely removed from the adult world around her in the specific way that children can disappear into books, like they're stepping through a door. And then the terrace door opened, and a man walked through it that Ethan didn't recognize, but Victoria did. He could tell by the way her body registered it, not visible to anyone not watching closely, but Ethan was watching closely. Her shoulders went slightly back. Her chin came up a fraction. Her expression didn't change, but the quality of her attention to the conversation she was in shifted in a way that meant she was no longer fully inside it. The man was tall, well-dressed in the particular way that people are who have been well-dressed so long they don't think about it anymore. Dark hair, early 40s, the kind of face that had probably been beautiful at 30 and had since transitioned into something more interesting, more complicated. He moved through the terrace with the ease of someone who'd been here before. Eleanor saw him and crossed to greet him, which meant he was expected. Invited. Victoria's cousin Celia appeared at Ethan's elbow from nowhere. "That's Daniel Ashford," she said, in the tone of someone delivering meaningful information to the correct recipient. "Victoria's ex." "Well, not just ex. They were engaged, actually, 3 years ago. It didn't end quietly." "Celia," Ethan said pleasantly, "why are you telling me this?" She blinked. "I thought you should—" "I know who he is," Ethan said, which was a lie, but it was a lie that required zero visible effort, and Celia, slightly deflated, drifted away. He looked back at Victoria. She was still in her conversation. She had not looked toward Daniel Ashford. This was, Ethan knew, a deliberate act, the specific kind of stillness that requires more effort than movement. Ethan picked up his drink, walked the few feet to where Victoria was standing, and settled beside her in the easy way of someone arriving at their natural position. He didn't say anything about Ashford. He didn't do anything pointed or performance-ready. He just was there, in the way he'd been there all weekend, solid, unhurried, without agenda. Victoria's hand at her side found his wrist. Not his hand, his wrist. Light, brief, the way someone touches a railing to confirm it's there. He didn't move. Daniel Ashford made his way around the terrace at the pace of someone comfortable in any room he entered, and he reached Victoria's cluster perhaps 10 minutes later, when the cousin and the aunt had drifted to the buffet table, and it was just Victoria and her mother and Ethan. "Victoria." His voice was controlled, pleasant, with an undertone of something that Ethan registered and did not like. "It's been a while." "Daniel." Her voice was clean, careful. "I didn't know you were coming," Eleanor said with the precision of a woman navigating a space she'd designed. "Daniel's been consulting for the vineyard. It seemed practical to invite him for the weekend gathering." She smiled at Ethan. "You've met my daughter's husband, Ethan?" The sentence was a test. Ethan could feel it. Eleanor deploying the word deliberately, watching Daniel Ashford's reaction, watching Ethan's reaction, measuring. Daniel Ashford's smile did not quite reach its destination. Husband, he said. That's new. Relatively, Ethan said. Daniel looked at him with the full attention of someone recalibrating. Daniel Ashford. He extended his hand. Ethan took it. The handshake was the kind where both parties know it isn't just a handshake. Ethan Calloway. Ethan's in construction management, Eleanor offered. She said it neutrally. Whether she intended it as a point in Ethan's favor or not, Ethan couldn't tell, and he decided it didn't matter. Daniel looked at Victoria with an expression that was trying to be good-natured and was about 60% successful. You kept this quiet. We're private, Victoria said, the same sentence she'd used all weekend. It kept being true. Right. Daniel glanced at Ethan again, then, with the particular intonation of a man who wanted to reestablish something and was framing it as lightness. I always thought you'd end up with someone more in your world. No offense, he added, directed at Ethan, with a smile. None taken, Ethan said, in the tone that means, I heard exactly what you said. It's just, Daniel gestured loosely. Victoria's world is complicated, demanding. The people in it need to be, Daniel, Victoria's voice was quiet and absolute. Don't. A silence that had weight. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. She looked at him steadily. I've heard variations of it from you before. What you mean is that someone like Ethan, without a portfolio, without a seat at whatever table you think matters, doesn't belong here. She paused. You said the same thing, differently, about me, when I was still building. You thought I hadn't arrived yet. You were generous enough to wait. Another pause. I know how that sentence ends. I don't need the reminder. The terrace was not globally quiet. Other conversations continued at their own pace. But in the small radius of their cluster, it was very still. Daniel's expression moved through something that wasn't quite anger, more like the rearranging of a face that had been caught in the wrong configuration. That's not what... I'm going to get a drink, Eleanor said, smoothly and without any particular effect, and excused herself in a way that was so precisely timed that Ethan suspected it was calculated. Her way of leaving Victoria the space to finish what she'd started. Daniel looked at Victoria for a long moment, then at Ethan, then back at Victoria. Something passed through his expression. Loss, maybe? Or the specific discomfort of a man watching a future he'd written for himself get revised. You seem happy, he said finally. He seemed to mean it, which made it harder. I am, Victoria said. It wasn't a performance. Ethan heard the difference. Daniel nodded once, said something mild about getting a drink, and walked away. Victoria stood very still for a moment. Then she exhaled slowly from somewhere deep, like releasing a pressure she'd been holding longer than she knew. You okay? Ethan said low. Yes. A pause. I forgot how much space he used to take up. She was looking at where Daniel had gone. Not physically, just his version of things. How easily I used to let it in. Ethan said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't either minimize it or overweight it, and she didn't need either. Thank you, she said, for not doing anything. Like what? Like posturing. He was waiting for you to posture. It would have given him something to push against. She looked at Ethan. Instead, you just stood there. I was there, he said. That was the point. She looked at him for a moment in the afternoon light, and Ethan saw something in her face he didn't know how to classify. Something that was working itself out quietly, revising something. The expression of a person arriving at a conclusion they hadn't started the day expecting to reach. Then Lily's voice came from the lounger. Dad, this part is sad. Both of them turned. Lily was holding the book with the focused sorrow of a child fully inside a story. I know, Ethan said. Keep reading. It's sad every time, Lily said, somewhat accusatorially, as if this were Ethan's fault. That's how you know it's good. Lily made the sound she made when she didn't want to admit someone was right and went back to the page. Victoria's hand found Ethan's wrist again, briefly, the same as before. Then she moved to sit beside Lily on the lounger, and she said, Tell me where you are. and Lily told her, and they put their heads together over the book, and Ethan stood in the afternoon light watching them and thought, 7 years. And I still have not found the adequate response to this. The afternoon shifted slowly toward the hour when cars began to appear in the gravel driveway, when bags were carried downstairs, when the assembled family moved through the specific choreography of departure. Hugs that ranged from genuine to performative, promises to stay in touch that varied in sincerity, the particular relief that descends over a gathering when it officially ends, even if it was, mostly, fine. Eleanor found Ethan alone in the upstairs hallway, carrying Lily's bag. Lily was downstairs saying goodbye to Thomas one final time through the paddock fence, a farewell that Rosa had apparently agreed to facilitate. "I'll be quick," Eleanor said, which meant she had something specific to say and had been waiting for the moment. He waited. She looked at him with the direct, unbothered gaze of a woman who had assessed a great many situations and had arrived at conclusions in each one without apology. "I don't entirely know what the story is," she said. "Between you and Victoria. I have questions. I think you both know that." "Okay," he said. "But I watched you this weekend." She paused. "The way you handle Lily, the way you stood with Victoria when Daniel was being Daniel, the way you didn't perform." She said the last word with specific intention, as if performing were something she'd seen a great deal of and recognized on sight. "I'm not asking for an explanation today. I'm telling you that I saw what I saw." Ethan looked at her. "What did you see?" She considered the question with the patience of someone who believed questions deserved real answers. "Someone who shows up," she said finally, "without keeping score." She looked down the hallway toward the window and the grounds below. Victoria has had people in her life who loved what she was, or who thought they could manage what she was. She looked back at him. "You don't seem interested in either of those things." He held her gaze. "I'm not." Eleanor nodded, once as if that confirmed something she'd already largely settled. Then she said, "Drive safe," and went back downstairs. He stood in the hallway for a moment, bag in hand, in the particular stillness of having been seen more clearly than he'd intended to be. Then he heard Lily from somewhere below calling his name with the urgency of a child who had thought of something important, and he went downstairs. Victoria was loading the last bag into the Range Rover when Ethan got to the driveway. Lily was beside her, still talking. She'd apparently made peace with the goodbye and had moved directly to planning a hypothetical return visit, which suggested she was, fundamentally, an optimist. "We could come back," Lily was saying. "In summer, Thomas would probably remember me." "Horses have good memories," Victoria said, not dismissing it. "That's what Rosa said." Lily climbed into the back seat and buckled herself in with the authority of someone who had decided the logistics of this return visit were settled. Can we listen to the playlist on the way back? The one with the song about the river?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "And can we stop for food? Not fast food. Real food." "Define real food." "Like a restaurant with menus." "We'll see." "That means yes," Lily told Victoria confidentially, and Victoria laughed. They pulled out of the Beaumont Estates gravel driveway in the late afternoon light, the stone house receding behind them through the oaks, the vineyard spreading away to the side in its precise and patient rows. Lily found the playlist. The song about the river came on. For a while nobody said anything, and the road opened ahead of them, and the light was the particular golden orange of late afternoon in the California hills. And Ethan sat in the passenger seat watching it move across the window, thinking about Eleanor's words, about Daniel's face when Victoria spoke, about a wrist lightly held, about the specific problem of being entirely in love with your closest friend and having spent 4 days watching it become impossible to pretend you weren't. Victoria drove in silence, which was its own kind of presence. She drove the way she always drove, with full attention, unhurried, both hands on the wheel. At some point she reached forward and turned the music down by one notch, not off, just enough to take a fraction of the weight out of the car. Lily fell asleep behind them around the first hour mark. The road was very quiet. "What did my mother say to you?" Victoria asked. She kept her eyes on the road. She'd seen somehow what Ethan hadn't, the exchange in the hallway. That she saw what she saw, he said. A pause. What does that mean? I think it means she's smarter than either of us factored in. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Did she ask directly? No. She said she had questions and wasn't asking them today. That's worse. Victoria exhaled slowly. That means she's deciding something. Maybe. Another mile of road. I'm going to have to tell her eventually, Victoria said. The truth. That we're not. She stopped. I'm going to have to correct it. Yeah. And I don't know what that looks like for her, for the family, for. She stopped again, and this stop was different from the last one, and Ethan could hear in it the thing she wasn't saying, which was, for us. He looked at the road ahead of them. One thing at a time, he said. She didn't answer for a moment, then, okay. It wasn't enough to resolve anything. It wasn't meant to be. It was just an acknowledgement that the weekend was over, and the story they'd told would have to find its shape in the real world now, and neither of them knew yet what that shape was going to cost. Behind them, Lily slept, turned slightly toward the window, Charlotte's Web closed in her lap, her face completely at peace. The playlist moved through its songs. The California light faded into Nevada gray, and then into the particular darkness of the road at night, and Victoria drove with both hands on the wheel, and Ethan stayed awake beside her without being asked to, the way he always did on long drives, the way he'd done on every long drive they'd taken together, because some things didn't need to be asked. They stopped for food around the second hour. A diner, not fast food, real food. Menus. Lily woke up when the car stopped and was immediately fully conscious in the way that children are, with no intermediate state between sleep and engagement. Is this a restaurant? Yes. With menus? Yes. I want pancakes. It's 6:30. Pancakes exist at 6:30. They sat in a booth near the window. They ordered. Lily got pancakes. She ate approximately half of them and then told Victoria at length and with great sincerity that she thought Margot the horse had seemed sad, and that she thought people didn't pay enough attention to whether horses were sad. Do you think Thomas was happy? Lily asked. Victoria considered this seriously. I think Thomas was reserved, she said. Reserved isn't the same as sad. Lily turned this over. What's the difference? Sad people, or sad horses, want something they don't have. Reserved ones have decided what they want and they're waiting for the right time. Lily nodded slowly, as if this had clarified something larger than the horse question. Ethan watched Victoria field this conversation with the careful honesty she gave to everything Lily asked, without condescension, without impatience, and he thought about reserved and waiting and wanting, and the specific terrible patience of knowing what you want and being unable, for various sufficient reasons, to simply reach for it. He drank his coffee, 1.5 sugars. Victoria caught him watching her, and he looked at the window. The parking lot outside was lit in gas station yellow, and a truck was pulling through, and a couple was walking their dog, and the world outside was completely ordinary, and he was sitting in a booth with his daughter and the woman he'd loved for 7 years, eating dinner at 6:30 in the evening in a diner in the middle of California, and none of it was extraordinary except that it completely was. Dad, Lily said. Yeah. You have the faraway look. Sorry. It's okay. She handed him the syrup, though he hadn't asked for it. You can have the rest of my pancakes if you want. He looked at the half-eaten pancakes. Thanks, Bug. You're welcome. She folded her hands on the table. Miss Victoria, she said, are we going to visit the horses again? Victoria looked at Ethan very briefly, a look that was a question and a complicated thing and an honest thing all at once. And then she looked at Lily and said, I think that's likely. Lily smiled, the uncomplicated smile of a child who has been told what she wanted to hear and believed it, and had no reason not to. They drove the rest of the way home in the full dark, the music low, Lily asleep again for real this time, and Ethan and Victoria said very little, but the silence between them had changed its quality, as silences do when the people inside them have said enough true things to shift the ground underfoot. They reached Portland near midnight. Victoria pulled into Ethan's street, stopped in front of his building. She kept the engine running. He unbuckled, turned to get Lily, who was a dead weight of sleep in the back seat. "Ethan," Victoria said. He looked back at her. In the dark of the car, in the yellowish spill of the streetlight, she looked, not uncertain, Victoria was rarely uncertain, but something adjacent to it. The face of someone standing at the edge of a sentence and choosing each word carefully. "Thank you," she said, "for the whole thing. For being there." "I meant what I said," he told her. "I say yes when I mean it." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. That quiet revision again, the same one he'd seen on the terrace. Whatever was being rewritten. "I know," she said. And that was all, because that was enough. And they both knew it. He got Lily out of the back seat, carried her. She was heavier than she used to be. She was always heavier than he remembered. Up to the apartment. Unlocked the door with the particular skill of a person who has done this one-handed in the dark 100 times. Got her to bed, shoes still on because some battles weren't worth it at midnight. Pulled the blanket up. He went back to the living room and sat down on the couch in the dark for a moment. The apartment was quiet, the way it was always quiet when Lily was asleep, which was different from empty, though it was both. He sat there for a while. Then he got up, turned off the lamp he'd left on, and went to bed and lay in the dark with the particular awareness of a man who had spent a weekend telling a lie that kept telling the truth, and who knew, with the clear, uncomfortable certainty that comes when you've run out of room to look the other way, that something had shifted and that it was going to require something from him he hadn't yet figured out how to give. Outside the window, Portland was doing what Portland does. Quiet, damp, the particular gray-green dark of a city that smells like rain and old trees. And somewhere across the city, in the apartment that had been on the cover of a magazine once, Victoria Ashbourne was either asleep or she wasn't. And either way, she was thinking about something. And Ethan Calloway lay in his bed and thought about the word reserved and waiting, and the specific long patience of a man who'd known for 7 years exactly what he wanted and had been, until this weekend, very good at pretending he didn't. The week after Napa was quiet in the way that follows something large. Not peaceful exactly, but the kind of quiet that accumulates in the space between what happened and what happens next. Ethan went back to work Monday morning. Project management for a mid-sized commercial build in the Pearl District, a converted warehouse that was becoming either a boutique hotel or a co-working space depending on which investor was in the room. He spent Tuesday on site in a hard hat, having a disagreement with the electrical subcontractor about load specifications, spent Wednesday in back-to-back calls, spent Thursday writing a report that nobody would fully read. Normal week. The kind that used to feel like enough. He and Victoria texted. Not constantly. They never texted constantly. Neither of them were people who needed the thread of constant contact to feel connected, but regularly, the way they always had. She sent him an article about horse cognition on Tuesday with the message, "Lily was right about Thomas." He sent back, "Don't tell her, she'll be insufferable." Victoria replied, "She'd be correctly confident." He sent back a laughing emoji and put his phone in his pocket and stood on a job site for 20 minutes, thinking about correctly confident and what it cost to be the other thing. Lily asked twice that week if Miss Victoria was coming for dinner. The second time she asked it, she also said she should just live closer, with the casual certainty of a 7-year-old who hasn't yet built the structure that tells you some distances aren't geographic. And Ethan said, "I'll let her know," which was not an answer, and Lily let it go, which meant she'd filed it. He didn't call Victoria until Thursday night. Lily was in bed. The apartment was in its late-night version of itself. Small, familiar, the residue of a day visible in the dishes and the backpack by the door. And he sat on the couch and dialed before he thought about it too much, because thinking about it too much was how he'd spent 7 years getting nowhere. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," she said. There was background noise. Her office. The particular quality of a large, quiet room with a city outside it. "Give me 2 minutes." The sound shifted, a door closing, the city going to a murmur. "Okay, hi." "Hi." He leaned back on the couch. "Long day?" "They're all long." A pause. "How's Lily?" "She wants you to live closer." A beat of silence. She said that. Direct quote, with her full chest. Something in Victoria's voice when she laughed, not the sideways laugh, a different one, quieter, more private, made him feel the distance between the apartment and her office in a way he didn't usually let himself feel. "That kid," she said. "Yeah." Another pause, the comfortable kind, the kind that was always comfortable between them. Then she said, "I got a call from my mother today." He waited. She didn't ask directly. She asked how things were going, how Ethan was doing, whether Lily had made it home okay. All normal. Victoria's voice was careful. And then at the end she said she'd been thinking about the weekend, and that she'd enjoyed having us, and that she hoped we'd come back. And then she said, a pause. She said she thought I seemed more like myself than she'd seen in a while. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "I said thank you." Another pause. "And then I got off the phone before she could ask anything else." "Okay." "Ethan." Her voice changed slightly. Not bigger, just more deliberate. "I've been thinking about something all week, and I can't stop thinking about it, so I'm just going to say it, because I think that's more honest than not saying it." His chest did the thing it did. He stayed very still. "Okay." "At dinner, when Daniel said you didn't belong in my world, and I said what I said." A pause. "I meant it. I didn't say it for the performance. I meant every word of it." She stopped. "And I think you know that. I think you've always been able to tell when I'm performing and when I'm not." "I can," he said. "So I just—" She exhaled. "I wanted to say it clearly. Outside of the context of the weekend, outside of any of that, that what I said about you, it was true. You have always been— You treat me like I'm a person, not a position, and that's—" She stopped again. "I don't take that for granted. I should have said that better, a long time ago." He looked at the ceiling. He was very aware of what he was not saying, and very aware of why, and he wasn't sure tonight that the why was as solid as it had always felt. "Victoria," he said, "you don't have to—" "Let me finish." He sat forward, elbows on his knees. "I know what you're saying, and I hear it, and I need a little more time to figure out what I'm saying back. Not because I don't know what I think, because I need to know that what I say is something I can stand behind when it's not Napa, when it's not a dining room full of your family, when it's just Tuesday, Portland, real life." A long silence. "Okay," she said finally. "Not hurt. Something more careful and more honest than hurt." "That's fair." "It's not about fair." "I know." A breath. "I know what it is. You're making sure." Another pause. "You've always made sure before you commit to anything." "It's how I work." "I know." Her voice was quieter now. "It's one of the things—" She stopped herself. He didn't push the sentence, let it sit in the space between them, half-formed, and trusted that both of them understood the shape of it. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll try." A pause. "Tell Lily Thomas says hi." "She'll know you made that up." "She'll choose to believe it anyway." He smiled. "Yeah, she will." He hung up and sat in the quiet apartment and thought, for the first time in a very deliberate and unguarded way, about what he was actually afraid of. Not of loving Victoria. He'd been afraid of that for so long it had become furniture. He'd learned to move around it. The thing underneath that. The fear that he would step forward and she would realize, once the weekend's specific atmosphere had cleared, once the performance pressure was gone, and it was just him, Ethan Calloway, project manager, single father, a person with a daughter and a small apartment and a job that didn't make headlines, that what she'd felt was the situation and not the person. That fear had a long history. He knew exactly where it came from. He also knew, sitting there on the couch, that Victoria had just said something she didn't have to say, had gone out of her way to say it clearly, outside of any context that would have required it, had said it because it was true and because she thought he should know. He sat with that for a while. Then he went to check on Lily, who was asleep with her arm thrown over the edge of the bed and Charlotte's web on the floor where it had slid off the mattress. He picked it up, set it on her nightstand, and stood there for a moment in the particular peace of a sleeping child, the specific privilege of being the person who gets to stand in that doorway. He thought, I have been very careful for a very long time. He thought, careful isn't the same as right. He turned off the nightstand lamp and went to bed. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The story they'd told at the Beaumont estate lived in a strange suspended state, true in the family's understanding, unaddressed between Ethan and Victoria, and increasingly heavy in the way that suspended things get heavy when they're not resolved. They saw each other twice in those 4 weeks. Once for Lily's school recital, where Victoria sat beside Ethan in a folding chair in the school gymnasium and watched Lily play a recorder piece with the focused intensity of a surgeon. And afterward, Lily had found them both in the crowd and said, "Did you hear me do the hard part?" And Victoria had said, "I heard it. It was the best part." Without lying, because it actually had been the best part. The second time was dinner at Ethan's apartment, just the 3 of them, pasta again, the same sauce. And Victoria had sat at his kitchen table and helped Lily with a school project about ecosystems while Ethan cooked, and the 3 of them had talked over each other for 2 hours. And when Victoria left at 9, she had stood at the door and looked at Ethan with the same expression she'd had in the car outside his building the night they came back from Napa, the one that was revising something, and she'd said goodnight and left. He walked back to the kitchen. Lily was putting her ecosystem project materials away. "She's nice," Lily said. "I know. Like, actually nice. Not just nice to me because you're my dad." Lily looked up. "Some people are nice to me because of you. She's nice because she wants to be." Ethan looked at his daughter for a moment. "When did you get so perceptive?" "I was always perceptive," Lily said. "You just don't always pay attention." The breaking point, when it came, didn't announce itself. Things rarely did. It was a Friday evening, 5 weeks after Napa, and Victoria had a fundraiser for one of the nonprofit boards she sat on, a large photographed event at a downtown Portland venue, the kind of thing that ended up in the society section. She'd invited Ethan 3 weeks earlier, before Napa, back when inviting him to things like this was simply what she did, because he was her closest friend, and she preferred having someone she could talk to honestly in rooms where most of the conversation was performance. He'd said yes, and the yes had been ordinary then, and now it wasn't, and he went anyway because he'd said he would. The venue was the kind that was all glass and renovated steel, the sort of building that wanted you to know it had been something industrial once. It was full by the time Ethan arrived, 200 people, maybe more, moving in the particular current of an event where everyone was visible and everyone knew they were visible. He found Victoria near the center of the room in a dark green dress that he registered, and then spent some effort not registering. She was in conversation with 2 men in suits who were the type to stand the way people stand when they're used to being the tallest authority in any given room. She saw Ethan come through the crowd, and the conversation didn't stop. She was too practiced for that, but something in her posture shifted in the way it always did, the fractional loosening that meant she knew he was there. He got a drink, gave her time to finish. She extracted herself from the suits with the diplomatic efficiency of someone who'd been doing this since her mid-20s and found him at the edge of the room. "You look," she started. "Don't," she smiled. "I was going to say you look like you already want to leave." "I don't. I'm fine. You have the face you get at crowded things." "I'm fine, Victoria." "Okay." She stood beside him and they watched the room for a moment in the comfortable parallel way. "Thank you for coming." "You already thanked me." "I'm thanking you again." He looked at her. She was looking at the room, and there was something in her profile tonight, something that had been there since Napa in slightly different form, some new tension, like a person carrying a sentence they hadn't yet found the right moment for. He was about to ask about it when he saw, across the room, Daniel Ashford. He said nothing, kept his expression even. But something in his stillness communicated it to Victoria, who followed his line of sight and went still herself. "I didn't know he'd be here," she said immediately. "He's not on the board. Victoria, it's fine." She looked at him with the particular intensity of someone who needed to be believed. "It's not. I would have told you. I know you would have. He meant it. Relax. She exhaled, looked back at the room. He's been making calls, she said in a lower register. To people in my circle, since Napa. I've heard from 2 people who told me he'd been asking questions. About us. About whether the marriage was… She stopped. Whether it was real. Yes. Ethan looked across the room at Daniel Ashford, who was in conversation with someone and had not yet appeared to notice them. He thought about the terrace at Beaumont, the specific angle of Daniel's expression when Victoria had said what she'd said, the particular kind of person who responds to being corrected by investigating rather than reconsidering. What kind of questions? Ethan said. The kind that are framed as concern. You know, I just want to make sure she's okay. I've known her a long time. The whole thing seemed sudden. Victoria's voice was controlled but tight. He's not being aggressive about it. He's being strategic, which is worse. Ethan thought about this. What does he expect to find? The truth, she said flatly, which would confirm what he thinks, that it was a story. She paused. And then he could reframe the whole weekend, the way I stood up for you, the way my mother reacted. All of it would look like we manufactured something and she fell for it. And Daniel knows… She stopped, turned her glass slowly. He knows my family's pressure points. He was engaged to me. He knows where it would land. The thing was, she wasn't wrong. Ethan could see the shape of it clearly. Daniel Ashford didn't need to blow anything up publicly. He just needed to plant enough doubt in enough ears that the story rewritten itself. And then Eleanor's warming toward Ethan, the permission she'd given herself to believe her daughter was genuinely happy, would retract, and the damage wouldn't be to the lie. It would be to Victoria. It would confirm, in her family's view, that she'd manufactured something, that she'd needed to manufacture something, which was worse than being unmarried. How much does he know? Ethan asked. I don't know exactly. Celia told him we said it started at a diner. He's probably been checking from there. She paused. She stopped again, and this time the stop was different, and when he looked at her face, he saw something he didn't often see in Victoria Ashbourne. Not fear, something more like braced. He's here, Ethan said. Not a question. He'd seen Daniel begin moving through the crowd toward them approximately 30 seconds ago. Yes, she said. Okay. He didn't touch her, didn't shift his stance into anything performative, just stood there, in the way he'd stood beside her all weekend in Napa, which was the way he always stood beside her, which was present, facing forward, without keeping score. Daniel Ashford reached them. He looked polished, calm, with the specific smoothness of a man who had prepared for this encounter. Victoria, he nodded. Ethan, a pause. I didn't realize you'd both be here. Small city, Ethan said pleasantly. It is. Daniel looked between them with an expression that was managing something. I wanted to say, I've been thinking about Napa, about the conversation we had on the terrace. Daniel, Victoria started, let me finish, please. He said it gently, reasonably. The voice of a man who knew being reasonable in public was its own kind of leverage. I've been thinking about what you said, Victoria, and I think I said things I shouldn't have. About Ethan's place in your life. That wasn't fair. He looked at Ethan. I apologize. Ethan looked at him. Okay. I've also been thinking, Daniel continued, and here it was, the thing the apology was the runway for, about how sudden all of this was. For everyone. And I care about Victoria. I've always cared about Victoria. And I want to be sure, he paused for exactly the right length of time. I want to be sure that everything is what it appears to be. That she's genuinely… What are you asking? Victoria said. Her voice was very quiet. Daniel looked at her. I'm asking if this is real. The 3 of them stood in the center of 200 people, and the question hung there. And it was the most honest thing anyone had said all evening. And it was also, Ethan recognized, a trap dressed as a question. Because if they said yes, Daniel had planted enough doubt that yes would be examined. And if they hesitated, if anything in their faces moved the wrong way for even a second, he had his answer. Victoria opened her mouth, and then something happened that Ethan had not planned and would not have been able to plan, because it came from the same place that She's My Wife had come from. Not strategy, not performance, but whatever part of him had stopped being carefully managed and had started simply telling the truth. "I've been in love with her for 7 years," Ethan said. The sentence landed without drama. He said it the way he might say the weather, clearly without armor. Daniel stared at him. Victoria went very still. "I didn't tell her," Ethan continued, and his voice was entirely steady, because whatever was happening in his chest, his voice had decided this was the moment and was behaving accordingly. "For 7 years I didn't say it because I had reasons that made sense at the time. She runs a company. I run a construction project and pick up a kid from school. I thought those were sufficient reasons to keep my mouth shut." He paused. "They were sufficient until about 5 weeks ago." He looked at Daniel with the calm of a man who has nothing left to manage. "So when you ask if it's real, that's the most real thing I can give you. I don't know what the rest of it is yet, but that part is true." Silence, or the version of silence that exists in the middle of a loud room, a localized still point. Daniel looked at Victoria. His expression had moved through several phases and had arrived somewhere that was, if Ethan was reading it correctly, something like recognition. The recognition of a man seeing a thing he missed when he had the chance to see it. Victoria was looking at Ethan. She had not moved. Her face was doing the revision thing. Not the small version, the large version, the one that meant something significant was being rewritten. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the venue lighting and everything to do with a woman who had just heard something she had not allowed herself to expect. Daniel said, after a moment, "Right." And then he said, "I see." And then he picked up his drink and excused himself with what looked like genuine grace and walked back into the crowd. And that was the end of Daniel Ashford as a conversation. Ethan and Victoria stood there. The room continued around them. Glasses clinked. Conversations rose and fell. "Ethan," she said. Her voice was very different from every version of it he'd heard before. Stripped of the professional layer, stripped of the careful management, down to something underneath all of that he'd heard only in pieces, never like this. "I know," he said. "You just—" She stopped. "In a room full of— I know. You couldn't have said that somewhere with fewer people?" "Apparently not." She made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite not a laugh. Her hand came up and covered her mouth briefly, and then came down. Her eyes were still very bright. "I've been trying," she said, "to figure out how to tell you something for 5 weeks, and every time She stopped. Tried again. "When you said she's my wife in that dining room," her voice dropped. "Something in me just—" She put her hand flat on her sternum. "Right here. Something settled, like it had been waiting for that exact word and I didn't know it until I heard it." He looked at her. "Why didn't you say that?" "Because you needed time." She said it without resentment. "You said you needed to know it was real outside of the context, and She stopped. "I know what it costs you to say something you're not sure of. I know how long you think before you commit to things. I wasn't going to push." "You were being patient." "I was being terrified," she corrected. "But yes, also patient." He looked at her for a moment in the loud quiet of the room. He thought about 7 years. About the birthday in the backyard where they'd talked for 3 hours in lawn chairs. About every late-night call, every folding chair in a school gymnasium, every kitchen, every long drive. About the specific patient architecture of a feeling that had never once gone where he'd told it to go. "I have a daughter," he said. "I know. She has complicated feelings about strawberry frosting and strong opinions about horses, and she cried every time at the end of Charlotte's Web." "I know. She's going to be a lot." "Ethan." Victoria looked at him with the direct, unbothered gaze that meant she had already thought about this, had thought about it carefully, had made peace with all of it before he'd finished the sentence. "She is not a disclaimer. She's Lily. She told me Thomas was calming, and she was right." Something in his chest that had been braced for a very long time released without fanfare. Just let go. quietly, in the middle of a room full of 200 people who didn't know what was happening, 4 feet from a bar and a table of untouched canapes. He said, "I should have told you earlier." "You told me when it was real," she said. "For you, that's the only time that counts." He reached out and took her hand. Not her wrist this time. Her hand. She let him, and her fingers closed around his with the quiet certainty of something that had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. They stood like that in the middle of the fundraiser while the room moved around them. And it was not cinematic. It was not effortless. There were 200 people, and bad lighting, and a tray of canapes, and the ghost of a complicated weekend and 7 years of very carefully managed feelings. And none of that made it less true. "I'm not good at this," he said, meaning the romantic architecture of it, the navigation of something new after a very long time of keeping it contained. "I know." She squeezed his hand. "Neither am I." "That's not reassuring." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her. She looked at him. And then, because this was what they did, because it was so deeply embedded in the DNA of the thing they were to each other, they both started to laugh at the same time, not loudly, not in a way the room noticed, but genuinely, the sideways kind, the kind that came from somewhere real. They stayed for another hour, moved through the room together, talked to people Victoria knew, and Ethan stood beside her in the way he'd stood beside her at Beaumont, present, unhurried, not performing anything, except that now the thing between them had been said aloud and was sitting in the open air, still new, still figuring out its shape, but there. Undeniable. His. In the car afterwards she drove, because she always drove, and he sat in the passenger seat and thought about the fact that nothing had resolved exactly. They hadn't made plans, hadn't said this is what we are now, hadn't drawn the map of whatever came next. They were two imperfect and somewhat emotionally inexperienced people who had just acknowledged a large, true thing and were now sitting in a car in Portland at 11:15 on a Friday night. "Where are we going?" she said. She meant it practically. She needed to know which direction to drive. "My place," he said. "Lily's with my neighbor tonight." She drove. At a red light, she said, "I'm scared." Of what specifically? Of messing this up. She kept her eyes forward. "You are the most important person in my life, and if I... She stopped. "I don't have a good history with this." "Neither do I." "You were a devoted husband." "I wasn't, actually." He said it plainly. "I was a decent person in a wrong situation. Those aren't the same thing." He paused. "I know the difference now." The light changed. She drove. "So we're both bad at it," she said. "We're both new to the specific version of it," he corrected, "which is different." She was quiet for a block. Then, "I like that framing." "I know, that's why I used it." She looked at him sideways, briefly, and smiled. The real one. The sideways one. The one that started this whole thing in a backyard 7 years ago and had never once stopped being the most honest thing in any room it appeared in. She pulled up in front of his building and put the car in park. They sat there for a moment. The city was quiet in the way Friday nights get quiet after midnight. Not empty, but settled. A few windows lit across the street. A cab moving slowly down the block. "Come up," he said. Not an invitation in any direction but the obvious one. Come up, have tea. Be in the same space for a while longer in this new version of things. He was not moving fast. He had never been capable of moving fast with anything that mattered. "Okay," she said. They went upstairs. He made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the dress and the heels she'd slipped off at the door, one foot tucked under her, and watched him move around the kitchen, and neither of them talked much. And it was not easy exactly, because easy was not the word for a thing with this much history and this much weight. But it was right, in the specific way that right things feel, not without effort, not without the awareness of how much could go wrong, but true. Fundamentally, stubbornly, undeniably true. She left at 1 a.m. At the door she paused, and he was standing close enough that the pause had a different quality than it would have had 5 weeks ago, or 1 month ago, or 7 years ago, and she looked up at him with the revised expression, fully revised now, nothing withheld, and he leaned down and kissed her. It was not the first kiss of a movie. It was careful, brief, the kind of kiss that is asking something rather than declaring it, and what it asked was, "Is this?" And what the answer was, yes. Quiet. Real. The kind of thing that doesn't need to be more than it is, because what it is already enough. She went home. He locked the door, stood in the hallway of his apartment at 1 a.m, and thought about how a sentence he'd said by accident 6 weeks ago in a dining room in Napa had turned out to be the truest thing he'd said in years. He thought about Daniel Ashford's face and about Victoria's hand closing around his in the middle of a fundraiser. He thought about Lily saying she's nice because she wants to be, with the casual perceptiveness of a child who doesn't know she's naming something important. He went to bed. He slept, for the first time in several weeks, without the ceiling conversation. The apartment was quiet around him, and outside Portland was doing what it always did. And somewhere across the city, Victoria Ashbourne was probably awake and probably thinking, and he thought, there will be a lot of difficult conversations ahead, and a lot of things to figure out, and none of it will be smooth. He thought, I can do difficult. He thought, I've been doing difficult for a long time. He closed his eyes, and something in him that had been holding a door closed for 7 years let it stand open, and he didn't reach back to shut it. That was enough for tonight. It was in fact more than enough. The beginning of something real is rarely clean. Ethan had known that intellectually before. He'd been through the beginning of something real once before, with Lily's mother, and that one had had all the hallmarks of people who move fast because moving fast feels like certainty. He knew better now. He knew that the actually true things tend to announce themselves quietly and then require an enormous amount of unglamorous work to maintain. So the 2 weeks after the fundraiser were not a honeymoon, not a montage, not the part of a story where everything clicks into place. They were two people who had known each other for 7 years, figuring out how to be a different thing without losing the original thing, which is harder than it sounds and requires more honesty than most people are comfortable with. They saw each other 4 times in those 2 weeks. Twice with Lily, dinner at Ethan's, then a Saturday at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry that Lily had lobbied for on the grounds that there was an exhibit about deep-sea creatures, and she had questions. Once without Lily, coffee in the morning before Ethan's site walk, and Victoria's first meeting, 40 minutes at a small table in the coffee shop on Burnside where they'd been meeting for years, except that now when he sat across from her there was the awareness of the kiss at the door, brief and careful and real. And that awareness sat between them like a new piece of furniture in a familiar room. You had to learn where it was before you stopped walking into it. The 4th time was harder. They'd had dinner, just the two of them, at a restaurant that was nice without being the kind of nice that required a reservation 6 weeks out. Victoria had ordered the things she always ordered there. Ethan had ordered wrong, the pasta, which sounded better than it was. And they'd talked about work, about Lily's school project that had received a commendation from her teacher, about a board situation at Victoria's company that was consuming more of her week than it should have been. And somewhere in the middle of the main course, Victoria had said carefully, the thing that had been sitting at the edge of several conversations. I've been thinking about what we do about my family. He'd set down his fork. Okay. They think we're married. She kept her voice low. Not because anyone around them was listening, but because the sentence required it. My mother thinks we're married. She called me again last week. Warmer. Asking how we are. Asking if Ethan might want to come to the Beaumont again for the fall gathering. A pause. She's building something in her head. A version of me that's finally... She stopped. A version of me she can stop worrying about. And that's not sustainable, Ethan said. No. She turned her wine glass slowly. It isn't. He looked at the table. He'd known this conversation was coming. Had known it since the morning after Napa when they'd sat in that kitchen and agreed to let the weekend be what it was. The lie had a shelf life. Every lie did. The only question was how it ended. We have to tell them the truth, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She looked at him. And I don't know how they receive that. My mother in particular. She trusted what she saw. She built She adjusted something in herself based on what she saw. Finding out it started as a misunderstanding, She stopped. It's going to look like we played her. We did, a little. I know. Victoria's voice was flat with self-knowledge. I know we did. I made that call. You came because I asked you to. She paused. Whatever the fallout is, it's mine, not yours. That's not how it works, he said. Ethan, Victoria. He said it in the tone that meant, don't do the thing where you make yourself responsible for everything and everyone else peripheral. We made that call together. I said yes. I said the sentence in the first place. We're in this together, that's actually the point, right? She looked at him. The revision in her face, the one he'd been watching since Napa, had settled into something more permanent now, less active rewriting, more resting in a new position. Right, she said quietly. So we tell them together. She exhaled. She's going to have questions. She already has questions. She's been filing them for 6 weeks. She's going to want to know what's real, and I'm going to have to explain. She stopped. How do you explain that you asked your closest friend to pretend to be your husband, and then somewhere in the pretending you realized something you should have known for a long time? He said nothing for a moment. Then, you explain it exactly like that. She looked at him. It's the truth, he said. It's not a flattering story, but it's the true one. And your mother, I think she's more interested in true than flattering. Victoria was quiet. She looked at the wine glass, then at the window, then back at him. I hate that you're right about her. I've met her twice, but yeah. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. When? Soon, he said, before Daniel does whatever he's building toward. He's been quiet since the fundraiser. People like Daniel are quietest right before they do something. She nodded slowly. She knew this. She'd spent her career reading rooms and people. She knew the shape of what Daniel Ashford was likely to do, not out of malice, or not only malice, but out of the specific wounded pride of a man who had been publicly corrected and needed the record to reflect his version of events. I'll call her, Victoria said. I'll set it up. We'll go to her. Not another gathering, just the 2 of us, or 3 of us if Lily should come, Ethan said. He thought about it for a second. She's part of the true story. If your mother's going to understand what this actually is, she should see all of it. Victoria looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had not expected that answer and was doing something with it. You're sure? She can bring Charlotte's Web. She'll make friends with your mother. Your mother won't have time to be angry. This time the laugh was real. Small, but real. You're using my daughter as an emotional buffer. Our daughter, he said. Then caught himself. Looked at her. Don't take it back, she said. The same 4 words, different room, different everything, except the part that wasn't different at all. He left them out there. The call came before they had a chance to make their own. It was a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days after the fundraiser, and Ethan was on site in the Pearl District watching the electrical crew finish a run that had been giving him grief for a week when Victoria called. He stepped away from the noise. Daniel went to my mother, she said. No preamble, his jaw tightened. When? Last night, apparently. He went to her house, brought... I don't know exactly what he brought, some of what he'd gathered, whatever he'd been building. He told her he had reason to believe the marriage wasn't real, that we'd manufactured it for the gathering. Her voice was controlled in the way that meant she'd already processed the first wave of it and was now operating in the strategic layer. My mother called me this morning. She said she wanted to hear my side before she said anything. What did you tell her? I said I needed to come in person. She agreed. A pause. She didn't sound angry, Ethan. She sounded... a breath. Hurt. Which is worse. He stood in the noise of the construction site and thought about Eleanor Ashbourne standing in her house being told by a man with a wounded ego that her daughter had built something false for her benefit. Thought about the specific quality of Eleanor's gaze, the one that filed things, assessed things, waited for the right moment. Thought about her saying someone who shows up without keeping score. When are you going there? He asked. Friday. I was hoping... I'll rearrange Friday, he said. Tell me the time. A pause. You don't have to, Victoria. Right. Another pause. 11 in the morning, she's in Lake Oswego. I'll be there. He hung up and stood on the job site for a moment. One of the crew said something to him about the conduit run, and he answered it correctly and completely while operating in a parallel track of his mind that was calculating what Friday required. He'd need to get Lily to school, reschedule his 11 o'clock, figure out whether to bring Lily directly or pick her up from school and take her to Victoria's office first, and then drive to Lake Oswego together. He thought about Eleanor Ashbourne hearing Daniel Ashford's version of events. He thought about what it costs a person to adjust their understanding of their child, to allow themselves to believe something generous and true, and then be told they were wrong to believe it. He thought, we should have gone sooner. He thought, we should have been the first ones to say it. He called Victoria back. Lily gets out of school at 3:15, he said. If your mother can do 4 instead of 11, we bring Lily, and we do it right. Ethan, it's fine. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He was walking back toward the building now, hard hat in hand. I want to. There's a difference. You told me that. Silence on the line. I'll call her, Victoria said. Eleanor agreed to 4 o'clock. Friday came the way Fridays come when you've been counting toward them, arriving before you're ready and after you've already exhausted yourself preparing. Ethan picked Lily up from school at 3:15. She was in her regular clothes by then, had changed from her uniform at some point in the day with the help of the after-school program, and she climbed into the car with her backpack and her book and an expression that said she had strong opinions about something. Sasha took my eraser, she announced. Did you get it back? Eventually, it took a while. She buckled herself in. Where are we going? This isn't the way home. We're going to visit Miss Victoria's mom. You met her at the gathering. Lily thought about this. The one who knew about Thomas and Margot. That's her. She seemed smart. Lily opened her book. Is Miss Victoria going to be there? Yes. Okay. She found her page. Will there be food? Probably. Okay. She returned to her book with the complete subject closure that was one of her more efficient qualities and read for the rest of the drive. Victoria was waiting outside Eleanor's house when they pulled up. A gray shingled house in a quiet Lake Oswego neighborhood, more modest than the Beaumont estate, but with the same quality of things chosen with care. She was in a camel-colored coat, standing with her hands in her pockets, and she looked at Ethan when he got out of the car with an expression that was braced and real and only slightly held together. He walked to her. How are you? I've been better. She glanced at Lily, who was extracting herself and her book from the back seat. Thank you for bringing her. She had opinions about Sasha taking her eraser. I heard that, Lily said from behind him. Who's Sasha? Victoria asked her. A girl in my class. Lily hoisted her backpack. She borrows things without asking. Annoying. Very. Lily looked at the house. Do we knock or ring? Ring, Victoria said, and led the way. Eleanor opened the door before the ring finished, which meant she'd been watching for them, which meant she'd been standing somewhere near the front of the house waiting, which Ethan noted and filed without comment. She looked at all 3 of them. Her gaze moved from Victoria to Ethan to Lily in a sequence that was not cold, but was not the warmth of the Beaumont morning. It was the gaze of a woman who had received information and had not yet decided what to do with it. Come in, she said. The house was warm and clean and had the particular quality of a space lived in alone. Everything arranged with intention, nothing left in the habitual disorder of people who share space. Books, framed photographs, a kitchen that smelled like coffee recently made. Lily went directly to the photographs on the sideboard. Is this you? She asked Eleanor, pointing at one. Eleanor came to look. When I was about your age, yes. You look serious. I was serious. I'm serious too sometimes, Lily said, but mostly at school. She looked at the next photograph. Is this Miss Victoria? At 16. Lily studied it with the focused attention she gave to things that interested her. She looks the same. Does she? In the eyes. Lily looked at Victoria, who was standing in the entrance to the living room. "You have the same eyes in that picture, like you're thinking about something." Victoria looked at her for a moment. "I usually am." "Me too," Lily said, and moved to the next photograph, apparently satisfied. Eleanor watched this child work her way down the sideboard, and something in her face shifted a fraction. Not resolved, not softened into anything simple, but moved. The specific movement of a person encountering something that doesn't fit the narrative they've been handed. They sat down. Eleanor had made coffee, had put out a small plate of cookies that Lily immediately and politely took one from and ate with focused efficiency. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet before important conversations. Eleanor looked at Victoria. "Tell me," she said. Victoria told her. She told it plainly, not confessionally, not with excessive apology, but honestly, starting from the beginning. The gathering invitation, the weight of it, asking Ethan to come. The waitress, the assumption, the sentence Ethan said, and the 4 words she'd said back. She told it all the way through, the weekend, the performance they'd maintained, the reason she'd wanted it, what it had cost, what it had revealed. She didn't minimize the lie, didn't dress it up, didn't reframe it as something other than what it was. Ethan sat beside her and said nothing while she spoke. He'd made a decision about this on the drive down. It was Victoria's truth to tell, her mother to face, and his job was to be present for it, not to intercept or redirect or manage the reception. He watched Eleanor's face as Victoria talked, the particular stillness of a woman taking in information and sitting with it rather than reacting before she'd finished receiving it. When Victoria finished, the room was quiet. Lily, who had listened to approximately none of this, she was looking at a book from Eleanor's coffee table about coastal birds of the Pacific Northwest, which had apparently replaced Charlotte's Web as the afternoon's interest, said, without looking up, "Is this a pelican?" "Yes," Eleanor said, automatically. "Their pouches hold a lot," Lily said, "more than their stomach." Eleanor looked at her. "That's right." Lily nodded and turned the page. Eleanor looked at Victoria. "You should have told me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of something that was simply true and hurt in a simple, uncomplicated way. "Yes," Victoria said, "I should have." "I understand why you didn't." Eleanor's voice was measured. "I understand the pressure you feel at those gatherings. I'm aware of what I've contributed to that pressure over the years." She paused. "That doesn't mean it didn't matter." "I know." "Daniel came to me because he wanted to discredit you," Eleanor said. "He wanted me to feel manipulated enough to, I'm not sure, distance myself perhaps, make you smaller to me than you are." She paused. "He misjudged how I feel about my daughter." Victoria looked at her mother with an expression that was working very hard to stay composed and was about 70% successful. "But I'm not going to pretend it didn't land," Eleanor continued, "because it did. Finding out that the thing that made me think you were finally—" She stopped, reset, looked at the window for a moment. "I had started to believe you were happy, in a way I hadn't seen in a while." "She is." Both women looked at Ethan. He'd said it quietly without planning to, but it was true, so he let it stand. "She's happy," he said. "Not the same way she was pretending to be happy at the gathering. I know the difference. I've known her for 7 years. He looked at Eleanor. "The marriage story was a lie. What wasn't a lie was every other thing you saw that weekend. The way she talked about you in the car on the way down. The fact that she brought me because she trusts me. The way she stood up for me to Daniel on the terrace. None of that was manufactured." He paused. "The relationship between us is real. It didn't have the right word yet." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "And it does now?" she said. He held her gaze. "Working on it." Something moved through Eleanor's face, complex and unfinished, the expression of a woman with a great deal of intelligence and a great deal of history with her daughter, reassembling a picture that had been disturbed, not restored to what it was, reassembled into something new. "I don't like being lied to," she said. "I know," Victoria said. even with good reasons. I know. And I think Eleanor stopped, looked at the coffee table, then back at Victoria. I think you've spent a long time coming to gatherings with armor, performing at me, and I think that's partly on you and partly on me, and partly on how we've been with each other. She paused. I don't think it started at the Beaumont. Victoria looked at her mother and said nothing, which was the truest answer she could give. I'd like to try differently, Eleanor said, if that's something you're interested in. Yes, Victoria said. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She cleared her throat. Yes, I'd like that. Eleanor looked at Ethan. And you're genuinely... Yes, he said, genuinely. She seemed to decide something, not completely, not with all her reservations resolved, but enough. All right, she said, in the tone of someone moving forward. Lily looked up from the bird book. Can I have another cookie? Eleanor looked at her. You may, she said, and there was something in the way she said it. Not quite the warmth of the Beaumont morning, but something working toward it again, more honestly earned this time. Lily took the cookie. Thank you. She looked at Eleanor with the direct, assessing gaze that was entirely her own. Are you sad? Lily, Ethan started. It's all right. Eleanor looked at Lily. A little, she said. Lily nodded. My dad gets that face sometimes too, when things are complicated. She returned to the bird book. It usually gets better. The room was quiet. Eleanor picked up her coffee cup. Victoria looked at the window. Ethan looked at Lily, who had already moved on to the pelicans again, fully and peacefully absorbed, carrying none of the weight of the conversation around her because she was 7 and the world was still mostly pelicans and cookies and horses with good memories. He thought, she is not a disclaimer. She's Lily. He thought, yeah. They stayed another hour. The conversation found its footing slowly, moved from the central difficult thing to the adjacent real things. The kind of talking that happens when people have decided to be honest and are figuring out what honesty looks like in practice. Victoria told her mother about the company board situation, the real version, not the polished version. Eleanor listened and asked 2 sharp questions that revealed she'd understood the business dynamics clearly. Ethan talked to Eleanor about the Pearl District project, and she turned out to have opinions about the renovation of industrial buildings. Her late husband had worked in architecture, and the conversation went somewhere neither of them had expected. Lily fell asleep in the armchair with the bird book open on her chest somewhere in the last 30 minutes. Eleanor looked at her and said nothing, but the nothing was warm. When they got up to leave, Eleanor walked them to the door. She hugged Victoria, a longer hug than the Beaumont hug, slower, with less efficiency and more weight. Victoria stood inside it for a moment with her eyes closed and something working through her face that Ethan looked away from because it belonged to the 2 of them. At the door, Eleanor looked at Ethan. She extended her hand, the same firm handshake as the Beaumont, and then she said I saw what I saw. That's still true. The context has changed. What I observed hasn't. He held her gaze. Thank you. She nodded once, looked at Lily, drowsily reattaching herself to Ethan's side, one shoe half off. Drive safe, Eleanor said. They drove back to Portland in the early evening, the sky going pink and orange over the Willamette, Lily in the back seat in the particular exhausted quiet of a child who has been somewhere new and needs time to process. Victoria drove with both hands on the wheel and said very little for the first 20 minutes. Then she said, Thank you. You said that already. I'm saying it again. He looked at her profile in the evening light. How are you? She thought about it honestly. Relieved, she said, and tired, and I don't know, something else, something that feels like the way a room feels after you've moved the furniture back to where it should have always been. A pause. Does that make sense? Yeah, he said. It made a great deal of sense. She's not going to just let it go, Victoria said. She'll think about it for a while. She'll have more questions. She'll circle back. That's fine. Is it? She's your mother, he said. She's allowed to take her time. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then, you told her we were working on it. We are. I know. She glanced at him briefly. I liked hearing you say it to her, out loud, like it was real. It is real. I know that too. She turned back to the road. I'm still getting used to knowing it. From the back seat. Dad. Yeah, Bug. Is Miss Victoria staying for dinner? Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria said, If there's pasta. There's always pasta, Lily said, with the authority of someone who has audited the kitchen inventory and found it consistent, and then she went back to the window and the dissolving orange sky. The pasta was the same as it always was. The sauce Lily preferred, nothing fancy, 2 burners and 20 minutes. Victoria sat at the kitchen table and Lily told her, in exhaustive detail, about Sasha and the eraser and the resolution thereof, and Victoria listened and asked 2 follow-up questions that were exactly the right questions, and Lily was satisfied. They ate at the table, 3 of them, and it was not a performance of anything. Lily spilled some sauce and said, ugh, and cleaned it up without being asked. Victoria's pasta was too hot, and she put her fork down and waited, which was a thing she never did with food because she ate at her desk more often than not and had lost the habit of patience at meals. Ethan noticed and said nothing. She looked at him. He looked at the window. After dinner, Lily went to brush her teeth and came back to say goodnight to Victoria, who was helping clear the table. Will you be here in the morning? Lily asked. Victoria looked at Ethan briefly. No, I have to get back tonight. Oh. Lily considered. Okay. She hugged Victoria around the waist with the sudden compression of a child who has decided a hug is happening and it's happening now. Victoria's hands came down onto Lily's shoulders with a careful, honest tenderness. Night, Lily, she said. Night. Lily detached, turned to Ethan. Tuck in? Yeah, 2 minutes. He tucked her in. It took 8 minutes because she had opinions about the blanket arrangement and then wanted 1 more minute with Charlotte's Web, and then said she'd been thinking about what Victoria had said about Thomas being reserved and had decided that the word reserved was underused. Underused how? Ethan said. People say shy when they mean reserved. They're different. They are. Shy is scared. Reserved is waiting. She looked at the ceiling. I think Thomas knows what he wants. He's just not ready to show you yet. Ethan sat on the edge of her bed. Where did you get that? Victoria said it, Lily yawned, about horses. But I think it's about people too. He looked at his daughter for a moment. I think you're right. I know. She turned on her side to, Night, Dad. Night, Bug. He turned off the lamp and went back to the kitchen. Victoria was standing at the counter with her coat on, ready to leave, but she hadn't moved yet. She was looking at the window above the sink, the dark glass reflecting the kitchen back at itself. The ordinary mess of an evening meal recently finished. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She turned around. She said you told her reserved means waiting, he said. Not scared. Victoria held his gaze. It does. And you think that's... I think you've been waiting a long time, she said. And I think I have too, and I think we've both been calling it something else. She paused. Practical, sensible, careful. She said the words without judgment, just recognition. But it was waiting. Yeah, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was quiet around them, and Lily was asleep down the hall, and outside Portland was being Portland, damp and dark and entirely unbothered, and they were 2 people standing 8 feet apart in a kitchen that smelled like pasta sauce and dish soap at 8:45 on a Friday evening. He crossed the kitchen. She didn't move. He stopped in front of her and she looked up at him with the expression fully open now. No revision in progress, nothing being managed, just Victoria Ashbourne, the real version, the complete one, looking at him without any of the distance. He kissed her. Not the careful questioning kiss from the apartment door 11 days ago. Something more deliberate, with the weight of 7 years and 1 complicated weekend and 2 weeks of figuring out what came next in an honest conversation in a Lake Oswego living room. She kissed him back with the same weight. When they stopped, she rested her forehead briefly against his, which she had never done before, and which turned out to be the most quietly intimate thing that had happened between them, more than the kiss somehow, the particular trust of that. You should stay, he said. I'll make up the couch. She pulled back, looked at him. The couch. We're not moving fast, he said. She held his gaze for a second. Then she said, I wasn't suggesting anything different. I know. He held her gaze back. I'm just saying it clearly, she said. I know. I appreciate it. She shrugged off her coat, hung it on the chair, and sat back down at the table with the ease of someone who has just been given permission to stop leaving. Do you have tea? I always have tea. Then make tea and tell me what Lily's teacher said about the ecosystem project. He made tea. He told her about the ecosystem project. They sat at the kitchen table until 11, talking about nothing that required management. Her company, his job site, a book she'd been reading, the coastal bird book Lily had found at Eleanor's, and the conversation about pelicans. The ordinary movement of two people learning the texture of each other's daily life at a pace that felt sustainable. He made up the couch. She slept there. He knew because at 2 a.m. he heard her shift and resettle, the particular sound of a person sleeping in an unfamiliar space, and he lay in his bed and thought, she's here, in the apartment, asleep on the couch, like something that makes sense. He thought about what Lily had said. Reserved is waiting. He thought, I've been waiting. He thought, I'm done waiting. He went to sleep, and the apartment held all three of them through the night without difficulty, which was perhaps not as small a thing as it sounded. In the morning, Lily discovered Victoria asleep on the couch at 6:42 and woke her by sitting in the armchair across from her and reading aloud from Charlotte's Web at a volume that was technically indoor but only just. Victoria opened her eyes. Lily looked at her over the top of the book. Good morning. Good morning. Victoria's voice was the voice of someone not yet at full capacity. I'm at the sad part, Lily said. Again? It's always the sad part eventually. Lily lowered the book. Do you want breakfast? Dad makes eggs. He makes them wrong, but they taste okay. Victoria looked at this child, serious and direct and entirely herself, sitting in an armchair at 6:42 in the morning with a book about a spider, entirely comfortable with the fact of Victoria's presence as if it were the most natural thing, as if it had always been like this, as if there had never been a question about whether Victoria belonged in this apartment on a Saturday morning. Yes, Victoria said. I want breakfast. Okay. Lily went back to her book. I'll tell him you're awake. She got up and padded down the hall toward Ethan's room, calling his name in the manner of someone who has never once in her life considered that people might want to be woken gently. Victoria sat up on the couch and looked at the morning light coming through the apartment windows, the ordinary gray gold of a Portland Saturday, and she thought about Eleanor's house, and the conversation that had been hard, and the conversation that had been harder, and the way Ethan had said we're in this together without any performance around it. She thought about reserved and waiting. She thought, not anymore. From the kitchen, the sound of Ethan starting the wrong eggs. From down the hall, Lily explaining something to him at volume. The smell of coffee, the ordinary light, the specific early morning texture of a Saturday in a home where people lived. She got up, went to the kitchen, and sat at the table. Ethan looked at her over his shoulder. How do you want yours? However you make them, she said. He turned back to the pan. They come out a little overdone on the edges. That's fine. It's not a skill of mine. Ethan, she put her hands on the table. I've known you 7 years. I know you can't make eggs. Make the eggs. He made the eggs. They came out a little overdone on the edges. They were fine. The overdone eggs became a recurring joke between them that carried further than either of them expected. It became the thing Victoria mentioned when people asked how she and Ethan had finally gotten together. Not the Napa weekend, not the fundraiser, not the kiss at the apartment door, but the morning after Eleanor's, sitting at the kitchen table with slightly burned edges on the eggs, and Lily reading aloud about a spider dying while the Portland Saturday came through the windows gray and unhurried. She'd say, he made me eggs that weren't quite right, and I stayed anyway, and I think that was the moment I understood what I'd been choosing. It was a better story than the real beginning, which involved a misunderstanding in a dining room and 4 words that changed everything. Or maybe it was the same story, told from a different angle. Maybe both things were true simultaneously, that it started with an accident and solidified over burned eggs. And the truth was somewhere in the whole arc, rather than any single point along it. That was the thing neither of them had understood at the beginning, when they were navigating the weekend and the weeks after with the careful attention of people who know they're handling something fragile. Love doesn't have a single origin point. It accumulates. It settles in layers the way sediment does, each layer so thin you don't notice it arriving until you look back and see how much has built up beneath your feet without your conscious participation. 7 years of layers. 7 years of showing up and paying attention and choosing each other's company without naming what the choosing meant. The accumulated weight of it was what made the rest, the difficult conversations, the adjustment, the figuring out, feel less impossible than it might have otherwise. They weren't building from nothing. They were just finally calling it what it was. November came in the particular way Portland Novembers do, slow and wet and amber at the edges, the city settling into its indoor season. Ethan's project in the Pearl District reached the phase where the worst problems had been solved and only the detailed finishing work remained, which was the phase he liked least because it required patience rather than problem solving. Victoria's board situation resolved in her favor after 3 weeks of the kind of internal maneuvering that she was good at and never particularly enjoyed. Lily started a new book, a series about a girl who discovers she can talk to animals, and declared it almost as good as Charlotte's Web, which was high praise by her metrics. They found a rhythm. Not a perfect rhythm. There were weeks when Victoria's schedule compressed into something that left her available only in narrow windows, when Ethan would see her for 40 minutes between her day and his, and they'd talk at speed in the parking lot of a coffee shop before both of them had to be somewhere else. There were weeks when Lily had something every evening, school project, recital practice, a birthday party that required a present and a ride, and the diplomatic management of one child's feelings about another child's balloons. And Ethan moved through those weeks on the particular autopilot of a single parent who has learned to be everywhere at once without making it look like effort. They were not in each other's pockets. Their lives had been built separately for a long time, and the joining of them was not a merger so much as a gradual and imperfect overlap. Two things occupying increasingly shared space while still maintaining their own structure. It wasn't always easy. Ethan was not a person who communicated difficulty automatically. He'd spent years being the one who held things steady, who didn't add his weight to rooms that were already heavy, and some of that was admirable, and some of it was a habit that had calcified past usefulness. Victoria saw it. She called it out once in December, when he'd been off for 3 days and hadn't said anything about why, and she'd finally sat down across from him at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed and said, "You're allowed to tell me when something's wrong." "I know," he said. "You know theoretically," she said. "In practice, you go quiet and wait for it to pass." He looked at the table. I'm not criticizing the thing," she said. "I'm saying it doesn't have to work that way with me. You don't have to wait it out alone." He looked at her. This was the version of Victoria that he'd known existed all along. Direct, without armor, choosing honesty because it was more respectful than diplomacy. "The project has a problem," he said. "The hotel client changed the finish specs 3 weeks out, and the subcontractors are. It's a financial liability issue that I don't know how to fix yet, and I've been working on it every night and not sleeping well." He paused. "It's not a crisis. It's a problem I'm managing." "But it's been eating at you." "Yes." "Okay." She folded her hands on the table. "Tell me the specifics." "Victoria, it's not your—" "Tell me the specifics," she said again. Not impatiently, just clearly. He told her. She listened without interruption, which was a skill she'd developed professionally and which was rarer than it should be. When he finished, she said, "Have you talked to the client directly about the liability split?" "They're resistant." "What's their exposure if it goes to dispute?" He hadn't calculated it from their side. He sat there for a moment realizing he hadn't. "I don't know exactly." "Calculate it and put it in a document and send it to them before you request the meeting. Give them the math." She paused. People resist conversations they feel like they're losing before they start. Change the frame. It was not a complicated suggestion. It was the suggestion of someone who had spent a decade negotiating from disadvantaged positions. He looked at her across the table and thought about all the ways people in his life had handled his difficulty over the years. The well-meaning but useless "it'll be fine." The anxious mirroring that made his problems bigger by reflecting them back amplified. The people who changed the subject because difficulty made them uncomfortable. Victoria had said, "Tell me the specifics." He thought, "Yeah, that's why." "Thank you," he said. "You can just talk to me," she said. "That's the whole point." "I know." "Do you?" He looked at her. "I'm learning." She held his gaze for a moment. "So am I," she said, which was the more honest half of the conversation, and they both knew it. She was not without her own habits. Victoria's version of going quiet was different from Ethan's. She didn't withdraw, she accelerated. When something was wrong, she worked more, filled her schedule, moved at a speed that made sitting with difficulty impossible because there was always the next thing. Ethan learned to recognize it by the specific quality of her busyness, not the ordinary productive busyness of a person running a company, but a frantic underneath quality, the motion of someone outrunning something. He'd seen it first in January, when a deal she'd been building for 8 months fell apart in 48 hours due to a regulatory change she hadn't anticipated. She'd handled it professionally, reorganized, redirected, and then she'd spent a week at a pace that concerned him, not in a crisis way, but in the way of someone who was not allowing themselves to land anywhere long enough to feel the disappointment. He'd called her at 10 on a Thursday night. She'd answered from her office. "Come home," he said. He'd started saying home when he meant her apartment, which had happened gradually and which neither of them had commented on. "I have 3 more things. Come home," he said again. Not demanding, just present. The specific tone of someone who has noticed something and has decided to say so. A pause. "The deal? I know about the deal. Come home." Another pause, longer. Then he heard the quality of the silence change. The background office sound fading as she moved, a door, her coat. "Okay," she said. When she got to her apartment, he was already there. He had a key by then, which had happened at some point in November with very little ceremony. She'd handed it to him and said, "For when Lily's with you and you need somewhere to work," which was a practical justification for a thing that was actually about something else, and he'd taken it without comment. He'd made tea. She'd come in and sat on the couch and not said anything for a while, and he'd sat beside her and not said anything either. And eventually she'd said, 8 months, meaning the deal, and he'd said, "I know." And she'd said, "I knew the regulatory environment was shifting, but I thought," and stopped and started again. "I miscalculated." "Yeah. It cost us a significant amount of credibility with 2 investors. Probably. I don't like miscalculating. Nobody does." She looked at him sideways. "You could be more sympathetic." "I could," he agreed. "Or you could let yourself be disappointed without needing me to manage it for you." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has been understood more precisely than is comfortable. "That's annoying," she said. "Yeah," he agreed again. "But true." She leaned back on the couch. "I hate it when a deal falls apart." "I know. I hate it specifically because I start thinking about everything I should have seen." "I know that too." "You're very knowing tonight." 7 years, he said. "I've had practice." She rested her head on his shoulder, not dramatically, just put it there, the way people do when they've decided they don't need to hold themselves upright alone. He let it be. Didn't make it into anything. Just let her be tired in the way she was allowed to be tired, in a room that wasn't asking her to be anything other than what she was. That was what he could give her that most people couldn't. Not the resources, not the professional expertise, not the social capital, the particular quality of not needing her to perform. She'd had rooms full of people who expected her to be Victoria Ashbourne at all times. He'd always been more interested in the person running the performance. She fell asleep on his shoulder. He stayed until she woke up an hour later, disoriented and slightly embarrassed, and he said, "You needed it." And she said, "Don't tell anyone." And he said, "Who would I tell?" And she said, "Fair point." And they ordered food and ate it at her kitchen table at midnight and talked about something else. This was the thing nobody saw from outside, the texture of the actual thing, the weeknight dinners, and the difficult conversations and the nights when one of them had nothing to give and the other one just stayed anyway, not fixing it, not solving it, just staying. It wasn't a story that made good copy. It didn't photograph well. It was unglamorous and imperfect and occasionally frustrating, and it was, for both of them, the most genuinely sustaining thing either of them had had in a very long time. Lily registered all of it with the sideways perceptiveness she'd always had, and said very little, which was its own form of acceptance. She stopped calling Victoria Miss Victoria somewhere in January and started calling her Victoria, without preamble, just switched, and neither of them addressed it. She continued having opinions about horses and eraser-borrowing classmates and the relative sadness of various books. She grew slightly, in the way children do in winter, a half-inch that showed up suddenly in the length of her sleeves. She started asking Ethan, with increasing regularity, if Victoria was coming to things, and when the answer was no, she'd say, "Oh," in a tone that communicated mild disappointment without catastrophe. And then she'd move on, because Lily had always been better than most adults at accepting the terms of situations. February arrived, and with it the particular restlessness that comes when a thing has been real for long enough that the question of its future starts to have weight. Ethan felt it first, but he was used to that. He was the one who'd been sitting with the big feeling longer, who'd had 7 years to think about what he wanted and what wanting it meant. He knew what he was moving toward. He'd known for a while. The question was the how of it, the when, the right moment for a person who took seriously the idea that some things, once said, change everything and should only be said when you're ready to stand behind them in every ordinary Tuesday that follows. He thought about it for 3 weeks, not anxiously, not the way he'd thought about things in the Napa aftermath when everything was unsettled, more like the way he thought about a project at a stage where the planning was complete and the execution was what remained. He knew what he wanted to do. He just needed the right conditions. The conditions arrived on a Saturday in late February, ordinary enough that neither of them had made plans. Victoria had come over in the morning. She'd started doing that Saturday mornings, showing up for the overdone eggs and the chaos of Lily's morning routine and the particular texture of a day without agenda. Lily had a friend's birthday party at noon that Ethan was dropping her at, which meant 2 hours of the apartment to themselves, which was still, 4 months in, a relative rarity that they'd both learned to value without making into a bigger thing than it was. They'd spent those 2 hours doing nothing specific. She'd been on her laptop at the table with something from work. He'd been reading. They'd talked intermittently in the way of people comfortable in shared silence. When he left to drop Lily at the party, he said he'd be back in 20 minutes, and she said she'd make coffee, and that was the whole exchange. He dropped Lily. Lily had opinions about the gift, which he'd wrapped incorrectly. The bow was asymmetrical. And he let her fix it in the car because she was right. It was asymmetrical. She ran into the party without looking back, which was how he knew she was excited. He drove back to the apartment. Victoria had made coffee and was at the window looking at the street below when he came in, her back to the door. She turned when she heard him. "She get in okay?" she asked. "She fixed the bow first." Victoria smiled. "Of course she did." He stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at her, at the specific image of her in his apartment, at the window, coffee cup in hand, comfortable in the space, belonging there in the easy way that had taken months to arrive and now looked like it had always been true. He thought, this is it. This is the right Tuesday. "I need to take you somewhere," he said. She looked at him. "Now?" "Yeah. I have..." She looked at the laptop, then at him. Something in his expression read correctly to her, because she closed the laptop. "Okay." They drove across the river. He took Morrison, which she knew he'd take before he turned onto it, and she said nothing, just looked out the window at the bridge and the river below and the particular gray-green of the February sky over Portland. He parked on the street in front of the diner, the one on Morrison, with the green booths, where she always ordered the same thing without looking at the menu. She looked at the diner. She looked at him. "The story I told your mother," he said, "about where we got engaged, Danny Kowalski's backyard." He paused. "That wasn't true." "I know that. But I'd been thinking, when I said it..." He stopped, tried again. "It wasn't a completely invented story. I'd been thinking about this place." He looked at the diner. "You come here and you order the same thing every time. You've done that for 6 years, and I always..." He stopped again. "I always liked that about you." that you knew what you wanted. You didn't need to look at the menu because you'd already decided. He turned to look at her. I want to be what you don't need to look at the menu for. I want to be the thing you've already decided. Victoria was very still. I'm not... He exhaled slowly. I'm not the easiest person. I go quiet when I should talk, and I think too long about things, and I have a daughter who will give you opinions about your gift wrapping and wake you up with chapter books. He paused. And I'm not going to pretend that building something with me is uncomplicated, because it isn't. Ethan, she said. Let me finish. He reached into his jacket pocket. I had a ring made. He said it without drama. It took 6 weeks. I know what you like. You don't like anything that gets in the way, nothing too large, nothing that makes you think about it while you're working. He opened the box. Simple, exact, a thin gold band with a single oval stone. Not large, not flashy. The kind of thing that says, I paid attention more clearly than any size could. I know we had a whole story about being married that turned out to be the wrong order. I figure we do it in the right order now. He looked at her. Victoria Ashbourne. Will you marry me? For real, this time. With the full information. She had not moved since he started talking. She was looking at the ring, and then at him, and her face was doing something that he'd only seen a handful of times in 7 years. Not the polished layer, not the revision, not the managing or the performing or the bracing, just her, completely her. The person underneath everything else, looking at him without any architecture between them. You had a ring made, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. 6 weeks ago, he said. I wasn't sure of the timing. But you were sure of the question. I've been sure of the question for a while. She looked at the ring again, then at him. Her eyes were bright in the February light coming through the car window. The honest brightness, the one that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a woman arriving at a moment she hadn't let herself expect. Yes, she said. Simple. No qualification. Just yes. The same way he'd said yes in her kitchen at Napa when she'd asked him to stay beside her through the weekend, because some answers are only yes and everything else is just managing around the edges. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He'd borrowed one of hers for the sizing. She'd never noticed. He'd replaced it the same night. She looked at it on her hand for a moment, then at him, and then she leaned across the gear shift and kissed him with the full weight of everything. The 7 years, the Napa dining room, the fundraiser, the burned eggs, the Thursday nights, the learning to talk, and the learning to stay. And he held it all with her because that was what he'd been built for, whether he'd known it at the time or not. They went into the diner. She ordered the same thing she always ordered without looking at the menu. He ordered the eggs, which the diner made correctly. They sat in the green booth for 2 hours, long past when they'd normally have left, talking about nothing that required urgency. What the wedding might look like. Small, she said immediately. Smaller than that, he said. They laughed. When they'd tell Lily, tonight they agreed, together, what to do about the Ashbourne family gatherings going forward. Go when they wanted to, leave when they needed to, not perform any version of themselves they didn't mean. He said he wasn't changing her name on his phone. She was still Victoria because that was her name and titles were for documents. She said she thought they should keep their separate apartments for at least the first year because neither of them was ready to have that conversation yet, and rushing it would make it harder. He agreed immediately. She looked at him like she'd expected him to push back. He said, I know what you need. I've been paying attention. She looked at the window and said nothing, and then looked back at him and said, I know you have. The ring sat on her finger, exactly right. And outside the Morrison Street diner, the Portland winter was doing what Portland winter does. Persistent, gray, entirely unbothered by the specific size of what was happening inside, and neither of them needed it to be anything else. They picked up Lily at 3:30. She came out of the party with frosting on her sleeve and her hair half undone from whatever arrangement it had started in, and she climbed into the back seat and said, There were strawberry cupcakes, but I ate the cake part and left the frosting. And then she looked at Victoria and said, You came, as if this were a pleasant surprise, despite the fact that Victoria was often in the car now. I came, Victoria confirmed. Lily buckled in, looked at Victoria's hand, which was resting on the center console, looked at the ring, looked at Ethan, looked at Victoria. "Is that new?" she said. "Yes," Victoria said. Lily thought about this with the focused seriousness she brought to things that mattered. "Does it mean you're going to be here more?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "It means that." Lily nodded slowly. Then, "Okay." She looked out the window. "Can we get food? Not party food. Real food." "We can get food," Ethan said. "The pasta place?" "If you want." "I want." She opened her book. "Victoria, you can pick the music." Victoria looked at him. He looked at the road because he didn't trust his face right now. She reached forward and found the playlist, the one with the song about the river, and turned it on low. And the car filled with it, and Lily read, and Portland moved past the windows, and that was the whole of it, all of it at once. The ring, the music, the child reading in the back seat, the city outside, the ordinary Saturday afternoon that would, from this point forward, be the afternoon he thought of when he thought of the beginning of the real thing. They told Eleanor that evening. Victoria called her from the pasta restaurant, step outside to the sidewalk, and Ethan watched through the window as she stood in the February cold and talked to her mother. He couldn't hear the words. He watched Victoria's face, which moved through things. Something careful at the beginning, then something opening, then something that was a kind of relief, and then, at the very end of the call, something that looked, just briefly, just honestly, like a daughter who has been seen by her mother and has not been found wanting. She came back inside. Her eyes were red at the edges, which she would not have admitted, and which he did not mention. "She cried," Victoria said, sitting back down. "Okay." She said she'd known, in the Lake Oswego living room, that whatever the story was, the real thing was there. Victoria picked up her fork. "She said she'd waited to see if we'd figure it out." "Smart woman." "She said to tell you she still thinks you show up without keeping score." Victoria looked at him. She meant it as the highest thing. I know she did. Lily, who had been eating pasta with focused efficiency and had apparently been listening with one ear in the way she always listened to everything, said, "What does that mean? Keeping score?" "It means," Ethan said, "doing things for people and expecting something back every time." Lily thought about it. "Like when Sasha lent me her marker but reminded me about it for a week." "Exactly like that." "That's annoying," Lily said. "It is." She went back to her pasta. "I don't do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't." She looked pleased with herself in the specific way of a child who has been confirmed in a good opinion of her own character and returned to her food, and the table was the way it had been since autumn. 3 people who had arrived at this particular configuration by an improbable route and had decided, each in their own way, that it was exactly right. The spring wedding was Victoria's idea, in that she was the one who said, unprompted, in March, "I don't want a long engagement. I want to do it while it still feels like a decision we're making rather than something we're waiting to do." He'd said, "When?" She'd said, "June." He'd said, "Okay." That had been the entirety of the planning conversation. The actual planning had been more involved and less harmonious, as all actual planning is. They disagreed about the venue. He wanted outdoors. She was worried about Oregon June weather being unpredictable, which was correct but not a reason not to try. They eventually agreed on a venue that had an outdoor space with an indoor backup, which was the construction manager and the risk assessor finding a compromise that worked. The guest list was the harder conversation. Her world was large and connected and full of people who had professional reasons to be included. And his was small and specific, and reconciling those two realities required several evenings of the particular friction of 2 people who care about different things, realizing they have to make a third thing together. Lily was involved. She wanted a role. She was given one, the person who walked in before everyone else and placed the flowers on the chairs, one on each, which was a job they invented specifically for her because she'd said she wanted to do something important, and they both recognized that what was actually important was that she felt included in what was happening. Marcus was not invited. This was Victoria's decision, made quietly and without drama. She told Ethan once, and he said nothing, and that was the end of Marcus. Daniel Ashford had, by March, stopped being a topic. Whatever he'd intended with the visit to Eleanor had produced nothing, and whatever he was doing now, he was doing it elsewhere. Some people, when they don't get the satisfaction they're looking for, Just stop. Ethan had never thought about him much, and the not thinking about him continued without effort. June arrived faster than either of them expected, which is always how June arrives. The morning of the wedding was not peaceful. Lily had a minor crisis about the flower placing job. Specifically, she had become concerned that 1 flower per chair was not enough, and had lobbied at 6 in the morning for 2 flowers per chair, which required a phone call to the florist that Ethan handled while still in his pajamas. While Victoria stood in the kitchen doorway watching him manage it with the particular admiration of someone watching a person do a specific thing they are good at. The florist agreed to 2 flowers per chair. Lily was satisfied. The venue was an old property outside Portland, a farm-turned-event space with a wide oak-shaded lawn that faced west and would, in the late afternoon, have the specific golden light that Oregon saves for its best days. It had rained the night before, which meant the grass was deeply green and the air had the washed, clean quality that makes everything look like it's been prepared. The indoor backup remained closed. They didn't need it. There were 63 people. Eleanor was in the front row in pale blue. Gerald was there. He'd asked Victoria personally, in a letter, whether he might come, and she'd called him rather than write back, which had made him laugh. Rosa the stable hand had been invited because Lily had asked, and Lily had been told that yes, if she wanted to invite Rosa, she could. Danny Kowalski was there, the real one, who had been very confused to learn that his backyard had been cited as a fictional wedding venue and had decided to take it as a compliment. Ethan stood at the end of the aisle on the oak-shaded lawn and did not think about whether he was nervous, because being nervous required some doubt about the outcome, and he had none. He thought about the Beaumont dining room, the waitress, the sentence that had come out of him faster than thought. He thought about 4 words whispered back to him, "Don't take it back." And the particular courage of a woman choosing, in that moment, to tell a truth she'd been sitting with and hadn't yet named. He thought, sometimes you say the true thing before you know it's true, and then the rest of your life is just catching up to it. Victoria appeared at the end of the aisle. She was in ivory, simple, exactly right, nothing that got in the way. She'd worn her hair down. She was walking without anyone's arm, which was the only way she would have done it. Victoria Ashbourne had always arrived places under her own power, and this was not the moment to change that. She walked with the particular steadiness of a person who has made her decision and is not reconsidering it. Lily, at Ethan's side, whispered, "She looks good." "Yeah," he said, "like she belongs here." He looked at Lily for a moment. This child, 7 going on something much older, who had spent this whole year quietly observing and filing and arriving at conclusions with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be indirect. "Yeah," he said again, "she does." Victoria reached him. They stood facing each other on the grass under the oaks with 63 people and the washed June light, and the person officiating said what officiants say, and they listened, and the words were simple because simple is what they'd both asked for, not the elaborate poetry of weddings designed to impress, just the direct and honest version. Do you choose this person in full knowledge of who they are, with the intention of choosing again tomorrow and the day after that, imperfectly, as people do? They did. He said, "I do," in the same tone he'd said everything in 7 years of paying attention to her. Clear, without armor, meaning it. She said "I do" in the tone he'd heard for the first time in a Napa kitchen over coffee, the tone that meant she was being fully herself, not performing any version of it. The real one. The complete one. When it was done, when they were facing each other with the quiet that follows a true thing said aloud, Ethan said, low enough that only she could hear, "She's my wife." Victoria looked at him. The sideways smile arrived, the real one, the one from the backyard 7 years ago that had started everything and had never once stopped being exactly what it was. "Don't take it back," she said. He didn't. He wasn't going to. And that was it. Not a clean ending, because their life was not and would never be clean. It was full of asymmetrical bows and overdone eggs and difficult board situations and a 7-year-old who woke people up with chapter books and had strong opinions about flowers per chair. It was full of the ordinary weight of 2 people building something together, which requires showing up when you don't feel like it, and saying the hard thing and letting the other person be bad at something sometimes without making it mean more than it means, and doing all of it again the following Tuesday without expecting anyone to notice. But it was true. Stubbornly, completely, irreversibly true. Built on an accident that turned out to be the most honest thing either of them had ever said. Refined through weeks of difficult and imperfect work, sustained by the specific, unglamorous daily choice to stay in the room and not keep score. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the right moment to say the true thing. Ethan Calloway had said his by accident in a dining room to a waitress who assumed, and the woman he'd said it about had had the courage to whisper, "Don't take it back." That, in the end, was the whole story. Two people who almost let a good thing pass them by and didn't. One mistake that was also, looked at from the right angle, the least mistaken thing either of them had ever done. The reception was loud and ran long, and nobody left when they were supposed to. Lily ate 2 pieces of cake and taught Gerald a card game that made no consistent sense. Eleanor danced with Danny Kowalski, who was a surprisingly good dancer, and the expression on her face was one that Eleanor Ashbourne did not often produce in public. Unguarded, genuinely happy, the face of a woman who had spent a long time worrying about her daughter and had arrived at a place where the worrying could rest. Ethan and Victoria danced once badly, because neither of them was a dancer, and they both knew it, and they laughed through most of it, which was better than dancing well would have been. At some point, well into the evening, Lily appeared at Ethan's side and tugged his sleeve. "Dad, yeah. I did good with the flowers, right?" He looked down at her. "You did great with the flowers." She nodded, satisfied. Then, with the complete and uncalculated honesty of a child who says what she means because she hasn't yet learned not to, "I'm glad she's staying." He looked across the reception to where Victoria was talking to Eleanor, her hand in her mother's, both of them laughing about something. The real laugh, the unguarded kind, the kind that meant something had been repaired and was now, carefully, being rebuilt. He looked at that and thought about all the ways you can love something without having the right word for it, and all the ways a wrong word said at the wrong time can turn out to be the rightest thing. "Me too, Bug," he said. Lily went back to Gerald and the incomprehensible card game. Ethan stood at the edge of the reception in the June evening, the golden light going slowly amber as the sun dropped, and he thought, this is what it is then. Not perfect, not easy, not the version of a life that impresses anyone from the outside, just real. True, built on the specific patient foundation of 2 people who had chosen each other, imperfectly and deliberately, every day since a waitress made an assumption and neither of them corrected it. Some stories start with an accident. The best ones stay true long after the accident is forgotten.